ladies and gentlemen, today is August the 6th, 2023, and we are here to talk about the world with World Discussion with Agent Smith. Smith. Foreign policy, economics, world history, you name it. Let's go. Live conversation. Add any questions you have to the chat. We begin with Agent Smith. Smith.
Hello.
Yo.
How are you?
I'm doing well. Getting back into the swing of it after my subathon and then the trip.
Oh, you went on a trip?
Yeah, we went to South Dakota to visit my family.
How was that?
It was good. Trisha got to go meet my family, and it was very nice there this time of year. It's a pretty cold place in the winter seasons, but the summer is quite nice. So we did some sightseeing, went for a hike around a lake, and there's this nature trail you can take that's a drive, and there are a whole bunch of different wild animals and stuff that are there roaming around that you can take pictures of, and some of them you can walk up and feed. There are some wild donkeys that are pretty nice, but if you walk up to the bison and feed them, they will impale you and throw you aside. So don't mess with those.
Yeah. That sounds pretty idyllic.
Yeah, they live next to Custer, which is right by Mount Rushmore. So we got to see that. Yeah.
Is it as exciting as it seems?
It's quite the work of sculpture for sure. Just how big it is and how crisp the images are. And I think one of the main feats of the whole project was that no one died in the process of making it. Yeah.
Huh.
Pretty rare when it comes to large scale monuments. Usually you have people who fell off something or were crushed by something or whatever, but yeah, everyone lived it. So relatively good safety practices for when it was made.
Well, props to them. That is certainly a better record than I would have expected.
Yep. But it's for people who don't live in the U.S., the four people on it are George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Teddy Roosevelt, and Abraham Lincoln. And I would say, at least from my perspective, the reasons why they're on there, George Washington was the general for the colonials, or who later became the U.S., and helped them win. And he had a ton of favor at the end of the war, so they wanted him to be president even when he didn't want to, because he was afraid of having like another kingship type of thing, which they just tried to throw off. And then Thomas Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence and other stuff, and he was president for a while as well. And Teddy Roosevelt is probably our physically toughest president we've had. He was shot in the middle of a speech, and he finished before seeking medical aid, so he's just a heckin' moose. And he did a bunch of Bull Moose Party was the party that he represented. He set aside a lot of U.S. land for national forests and national parks. So that was a huge early conservation effort, and just deciding, okay, we won't develop on these lands and we'll just preserve a lot of the health and natural beauty of the U.S. And then Abraham Lincoln, Civil War president, kind of brought the Union back together and won that war and officially abolished slavery. So
Also died.
he also was shot, yes.
Yeah, kind of a martyr figure in American history, among many.
Mm-hmm.
Who was the other one? Was that it? Washington, Roosevelt, Lincoln,
Jefferson.
right?
Yeah.
He was fun.
Jefferson was?
Oh, yeah.
What's something
He was
about
sort of
Jefferson
the,
that people don't know?
Oh, I doubt I know anything about him that people don't know. But he was just fun because he was such an idealist. He was a real true believer in liberalism, classical, liberalism. And, his writing and perspective has kind of resonated with reformists in the United States, among other places, pretty much throughout history, ever since that period in which he was active. Somewhat to the chagrin of the Texas State Board of Education, which has kind of taken a dim view of Jefferson over time. They think he's a little too democratic, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
So they've kind of mitigated coverage of him in Texas textbooks, history textbooks.
Mm-hmm.
Also, an eventful presidency.
What happened during his?
He was the one who purchased the territory of Louisiana from the
From
French.
Napoleon, yeah.
Yeah,
He needed to fund his wars.
yeah. Which was funny because Jefferson himself was a big opponent of a strong government, specifically a strong federal government. And he himself kind of went against his own grain by actually pursuing the Louisiana Purchase. He actually did not think himself that the federal government had the power, according to the Constitution, to basically unilaterally. Well, when I say the federal government, I should say the executive branch. He didn't think the executive, that is to say himself, the president, had the constitutional authority to unilaterally engage in negotiations and close the deal for Louisiana without substantive congressional approval. But he did it anyway. Because even though it ran against his own personal beliefs, legal and philosophical, about the federal government's role in the United States and its political system, he just thought the deal was too good. I mean, he literally doubled the size of the United States with one deal, and the price that was paid per acre was tiny. Like, it was an immensely good real estate deal in the grand scheme of things.
Well, the reason for that was this was a purchase out of desperation. So it wasn't as though he really wanted the Louisiana territory. It was sort of like Napoleon really wanted the war money more than anything. And he's like, yeah, I don't go there. I don't give a shit. Like, I want to win this conflict right now in the short term. So that was basically a purchase of crazy opportunity. So I guess he just did the mental math of like, well, normally the executive branch shouldn't do this, but this is way too ridiculous a deal to pass up.
Exactly. So a huge swath of the United States became a part of the country just because of that one deal, because of that one moment in time, as it were. Little history can turn on some weird stuff. That was kind of one of them. It actually, maybe this is an example of something maybe people aren't as aware of, but it actually ties into the Haitian Revolution. Probably most people listening are pretty familiar with that, right? I mean, most of the viewership is pretty history minded, if I'm not mistaken.
My short version is Haitian Revolution was, I think, the first actual fully slave-led revolt where they threw off their captors and basically just took control of Haiti.
Yeah, in the Western Hemisphere.
Oh, okay. So that's happened in the Eastern Hemisphere at some point.
Well, slave revolts have happened throughout history, to varying degrees of success. But as far as the African slave trade, within the context of the settlement and development of the Western Hemisphere, yeah, Haiti would be the first, and was quite significant and notable for that fact at that time and subsequently. So, yeah, the Haitian Revolution was a big defeat for France because Haiti generated a lot of revenue for them. Sugar and whatnot was a major driver of economic activity in the Caribbean at that time. Still is, but it's not nearly as profitable as it used to be. And when the revolution happened, the French government tried to suppress it, but it wasn't happening. It didn't work. And, that resulted in the French basically completely recalculating the importance of their Western Hemispheric territory. Well, I shouldn't say Western. Their territories in the New World, let's say. And so, after that defeat, they decided that maintaining a large military presence and, campaigning for further expansion in the region was a non-starter. And, it wasn't just about Haiti. It was also, the Royal Navy just being a beast. The French Navy was pretty decent in its own right, but the likelihood of them strategically competing with the Royal Navy for control of the seaways such that there could be substantive military operations in the Americas was not great. Most of France's resources were going into wars on the continent. That is to say, on the European continent. So, the cost benefit really didn't shake out. With Haiti, the tax revenue from Haiti could kind of maybe justify an attempt to engage in further operations in the Americas. But after Haiti was gone, not so much. So, to a degree, and this is highly debatable, but to a degree, you can credit the Haitian Revolution for the United States being able to expand as it did over the course of the early 19th century, because without that, maybe, possibly, the United States would not have been able to make the Louisiana Purchase and would not have gained as much size as it ended up getting correspondingly. So a little indirect linkage between the territorial composition of the United States and this revolt in Haiti that is otherwise pretty obscure in the context of American history. So Thomas Jefferson was responsible for that. Not the Haitian Revolution, but the Louisiana Purchase. He was also responsible for a pretty spectacularly failed attempt to put pressure on the British and French economically in response to, I forget what it was called, but basically there was a lot of tension over the impressment of American sailors into the French and British navies. Of course, there was a lot of conflict, going on the high seas between the French and British navies, and both of them scaled up their navies and correspondingly had a big demand for new sailors. And in so much as they were unable to find enough sailors at home, they would sometimes just sort of raid other ships and force other sailors, even if they were on neutral shipping, into service. And American sailors were obviously upset at that, didn't like that, and preferred that Washington do something about it. But of course, the United States was not nearly as powerful at the time as it is now. So there was a relatively limited scope for response on the part of Washington diplomatically. So what Jefferson did is he actually put in place an embargo on trade with France and Britain. The idea being that it would so disrupt commerce in France and Britain that they would be forced to come to the negotiating table and give concessions. This ended up being very destructive to the health of the U.S. economy, because, of course, as important as the United States may have been to the French and British trade in the Americas, the reality was that the United States was an export-dependent economy, and that trade with major nations, major trading partners like France and Britain, was much more important to us than it was to them, which meant that they had the leverage. So not only did this cause an immense amount of disruption to American trade and the economy, it did so basically to no discernible benefit. And New England in particular was very upset about this, because New England, even more so than any other of the three major regions in the United States at the time, well, maybe four, was significantly dependent on trade for the health of its economy. The South was mostly dependent on exports of cotton and tobacco. So they didn't really care that much. It didn't matter to them. Well, it did matter to them because it disrupted their exports, but it was more disruptive to New England because merchant shipping was the mainstay of the economy there. And without being able to legally trade with Britain and France, the mainstay of their business models basically collapsed. And they were forced to make very, very short-run arrangements to try to either find alternative arrangements or to find ways to basically ignore it, circumvent it. Smuggling was very common back then, so that was probably the preferred option. But even still, that caused difficulties in the short term. So a lot of people lost a lot of money on that and were very upset with Jefferson. More enthusiastic were people living in the interior, the sort of fourth region, so the region that was not on the East Coast, basically, the settlers in the developing part of the country in the Ohio Valley, sort of that area. They were more enthusiastic because they were a lot more skeptical about the British. One could go so far as to say as they were effectively Anglophobe, as the term would later come to be known. So they were quite happy to put pressure on the British, even though it actually ended up hurting the United States more. Kind of an early example of populism. That's probably what you could describe it as. So anyway, that lasted about a year, I want to say, thereabouts. Maybe somebody who knows more about it could kind of correct me on that. But it lasted about a year, and eventually the Jefferson administration kind of caved in and said, okay, this isn't working. Had to take a different approach, basically, a more diplomatic approach. So yeah, Jefferson was fun. Interesting guy. A little too idealistic for his own good, perhaps, but that's why people like him.
Mm-hmm.
You know, he was very much a authentic, true believer in the power of liberalism and representative government, for better or worse.
One of the funny things about people who are radical reformists in their time is sometimes they end up getting worshipped later on in a way that kind of causes you to forget that they were a heavy reformer. So another example of this would be Christ Jesus the Lord of Christianity, and how there's a lot of strictness, I think, about different ways that people can live within a lot of Christian media that doesn't really fit with how Christ was kind of a counter to the current power structures and at least the religious traditions of the time. So there's a lot of an effort to preserve certain religious traditions when at the time Jesus had the very radical idea that you didn't have to be Jewish descent to be a child of God. You could be a Gentile, which is basically just a non-Jewish person, and you could find your way to heaven through him. And that was a very radical idea at the time, and people who were traditional with the Jewish tradition or whatever, they talk shit about him, didn't really accept him as the Messiah, blah, blah, blah. So it's like one of those interesting aspects of he as a character for his time was a very heavy reformer, but now so a lot of people are very kind of focused on maintaining that tradition and not really thinking through that lens of, okay, how can you look at your society now and see what's wrong with it and how you can add some loving kindness where there was not before. I actually want to talk to my parents' church pastor because they go to a church in South Dakota, and Trisha went there with me. And cool. There's a lot of overlap between messages of different religions about being selfless and trying to help others and trying to be accountable to your own actions and to try to strive to be a better person. And I feel like between people who are religious of one type or another, or religious and non-religious, there's so many common cause problems that we can agree on and we can focus on. And I specifically wanted to have a conversation with their pastor because he's very down to earth and super chill and non-judgmental, and he'll talk to us about whatever. He actually talked to us about gaming and things and the games that he plays and what about the scene that he knows. And he complimented Trisha's tattoos and stuff. And a lot of times you'll have groups that are religious in nature and they're basically getting very juiced up on outrage media, and how outrage media is very, very different from the message of Christ, and how there's outrage media on both sides of the political spectrum, because I tend to browse more progressive stuff than I browse conservative stuff, just in terms of what I bump into based on what I tend to click. And it's a problem that we both share. And it's kind of like, for him as a pastor, the pastor leads the church congregation and tries to hold them accountable. Has he noticed anything about that? Because I'm kind of just curious from a former Christian's perspective, where it's like a sports team I used to play for and cheer for. Like, I still want Christians to find love and peace and success and stuff in their life. And this whole outrage media problem affects us both. So has he noticed a difference, and how does he try to counter that and keep people on the right path? Because he seems like a very down-to-earth guy, and he doesn't do the hate preaching like a lot of other pastors do. So it's an interesting conversation, trying to find truth in the world of, like, you're trying to get your news to rise to the top by being the most aggressive possible with clickbait.
It's always nice to see people kind of living up to the best of their particular belief system.
Yeah. And everyone's got their problems and stuff. It's just really unfortunate when someone will stereotype a whole group like, oh, conservatives are all like this, oh, liberals are all like this, or Christians are all like that. It's a bit exhausting. Give people a chance.
Yeah, people fall into prejudice very easily. You know, it's important to give it's important to give yourself a chance to be surprised, especially when it comes to people.
Yeah.
But that requires effort.
Yep.
And people do like to economize effort.
Exactly. It takes a lot of mental effort to think about the depth of a demographic as well, and that's part of why people will stereotype like people from a certain country too, like Americans are like this or Chinese people are like that. These are such massive countries, you can't put them into categories. Another one for our raging sexists and our people who are unknowingly sexist, when you say women do this, women are not a monolith. They're actually different kinds of women who have different personalities and different opinions on things. So women are not a monolith. Neither are men. Oh, there was one other monument that's near Mount Rushmore, the Crazy Horse Monument.
Oh, yeah. Did you see that?
Yes, I actually accidentally took Trisha there by taking a wrong turn. It was, we were driving and I was like, man, this route is taking a long time. And then we get to this area and it's like, wow, it's so pretty here. I was like, yep. And that's Crazy Horse. And I was like, that's Crazy Horse. I definitely went the wrong way. So we had to turn around and go back. But we were driving their General, which is kind of between a four-wheeler and a car. So it is road legal. But it's also like mainly an off-roader is how it drives. But that was really fun to drive around in. And we got to see Crazy Horse. I don't really know too much of the history of Crazy Horse. What do you know about him?
Oh, Crazy Horse. Honestly, I don't think I could summon much off the top of my head. I want to say that he was a significant leader of one of the local tribes, I think the Sioux, in the late 19th century. But if you pinned me down and asked me for specifics, I don't think I could remember. Indian wars are not something I've read a whole lot about. That's one of my weak spots. I've, like a lot of military history nerds, I tend to focus more on international wars between the United States and nation-state actors. But the Native American tribes we fought a whole bunch of wars with over the course of the 19th century and before, for that matter. There tends to be so many, they kind of blend together and get lost in the mix. They kind of lack the drama of wars like World War I or World War II. They tend to be much smaller, almost sort of bush wars in a sense. They last a short time. It could be very destructive, especially for the Native Americans. But the stakes for the United States government tended to be pretty mild. And even when the U.S. lost, the consequences were not like cataclysmic. So, in terms of military history, Indian wars, that is to say, the Indian wars that were fought by the United States, they tend to get a little bit of short shrift, unfortunately. I'm sure someday somebody who's really smart and creative will probably create a whole ass YouTube channel just about them, kind of elaborating on the history and the significance and whatnot. But, for now, it's kind of on the back burner. People are kind of focusing on other stuff in the community right now. But yeah, that's an elaborate way of saying, I don't know.
What did Crazy Horse do? I don't know. I think he led people. Yes.
Pretty much.
My dad read a book on him. I'm not entirely certain of this, and chat correct me if I'm wrong, but I think one of the things that he specifically did was he was able to unite other kind of tribes around his own tribe to meet with the colonists or Americans and take battles that they wouldn't have normally taken and that kind of thing. So kind of a unifying figure for a lot of Native Americans. But if anyone else has information on Crazy Horse and you have a take, we're not a show that claims to know everything, and we don't really know too much about this one. So feel free to share in the chat or the comments if you know something about Crazy Horse that we don't. But the monument is very cool. I heard that they're not going to be able to finish it in its entirety because there's some kind of like fault line or break in the rock. They intended to have him on horseback pointing in the distance as kind of the overall picture, but the horse part and everything that's under him is not going to work out. So it's just a dude pointing.
Yeah, it's a pretty ambitious project.
Yeah.
It's going, when it's finished, if it's finished, it's going to be very large.
Yeah.
I think it's bigger than Mount Rushmore.
Yeah, the mountain that it's on, you could really kind of choose how much of it you carve into the statue part itself.
Yeah, it's pretty much just like it was just one guy that had started it.
Mm-hmm.
I don't remember who it was exactly, but it was like his life's project, and he worked on it for a couple decades.
Mm-hmm.
And after he died, his son kind of took it up and has been doing it ever since. But because the team working on it is so small and under-resourced, like the production time, it's taking, it's been elongated. It's going to take like 50 to 100 years or something at the pace they're going. Something crazy like that. But if they can finish it, it'll definitely be noteworthy. It is a very cool project.
Mm-hmm.
I hadn't heard about them not being able to finish it completely. That's kind of unfortunate. I'm looking at what was supposed to be the finished project, and that would have been really cool.
Yeah.
Especially given the size.
Yep.
Yeah, 3 cheers for passionate people.
Good job, passionate people, making cool art projects that are on a massive scale.
Yeah, Mount Rushmore, I think, started pretty similarly. I think it was originally just an individual's project. And I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that the government picked it up after it had already started as a public works project during the New Deal. But technically it was initiated by just one guy, some years before that.
They have a lot of information if you go to Mount Rushmore in like the visitor center that talks about the sculptor, who I believe was a American citizen who is from like a German family that migrated there a while back. Mm-hmm. And I think his son helped carry on some of the stuff as well. I don't know if his father was alive for the completion of the project, but yeah, definitely a very, very huge scale operation that involved a lot of people. And you can see the old pictures of them like on this rickety piece of wood off the side of a mountain. And it looks very precarious because it was very precarious, but like I mentioned before, fortunately no one died. It's a relatively safe endeavor.
Yeah, all the more impressive considering how much dynamite they used.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was a pretty standard part of the sculpting process, as it were.
Yeah, if you need to get rid of a big chunk of stuff, it's way easier than tapping away at it with a pickaxe. Just blow the crap out of it.
Yeah. Yeah, they did it smart, though. Very, just the right place to take out just the right amount of rock.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it takes a lot of skill, so full credit there. Oh, was there any particular drama that you wanted to get to?
Chat was saying that there was some stuff that was going down in Niger.
Google says it's pronounced, yeah, you said it right, Niger.
Niger, yeah.
Niger. I always want to say Niger. I don't know why. That's not even that's not even how it's spelled. But
Niger.
Yeah, that's always how I want to say it. But Niger, yeah. Yeah, there was a coup.
Oh, jeez.
There was a military coup. And you'll probably be hearing more about it pretty soon, would be my guess, given how things have been going. There's been a number of coups in West Africa over the past couple of years. It's kind of a trend at this point. And kind of ties in a little bit to Russia. And I think we've talked on here before about how French influence in West Africa had historically been dominant, but has been on the decline, and that Russian influence has been rising, specifically by way of Wagner Group relations with this, that, and the other dictator in West Africa. So Niger kind of ties into that. There are some protests in Niger, celebrating the coup and, kind of welcoming in the Wagner Group and waving Russian flags and all this kind of thing. How much of that is genuine is, anybody's guess. Politics in the region can be pretty cutthroat in the sense that I mean, not everything is a paid protest. I don't want to be one of those people, but at the same time, Wagner Group kind of has a record of that to a degree. So I'm a little dubious just how legitimate some of that pro-Russian sentiment is. I don't doubt at all the anti-French sentiment. That's definitely a long-running theme in West Africa. So that's definitely genuine. And certainly there is a sense that maybe the Russians could make for better partners, just because there is so much suspicion of the French. So that is part of the impetus here for these coups in West Africa. But the reality is that these are not like democratically led coups, right? These are not popular uprisings per se. These are military officers taking the opportunity to seize power.
Yeah.
And, the unpopularity of the French, the possibility of working with Wagner Group, all of that is basically just a pretext. We're kind of in a weird era now where maybe it's not weird per se, but we're kind of in an era where ideologically driven international events are not really so much a thing anymore. A lot of it now is driven more by self-interest, ambition, what have you. Maybe Russia's invasion of Ukraine could be called ideological, but I don't really see that so much as ideological, so much as a personal project by one Vladimir Putin. So, even that isn't really a good example of ideology-driven policymaking. But West African coups, same thing, pretty much. Like, guys want power, governments are unpopular, they cite that as an excuse to kind of move in and seize power.
Well, the difference here is whether you attack and then justify it, or if you have a really passionate issue that the people are all driven toward, and then you make an attack around that.
Yeah.
So for Russia invading Ukraine, Putin just did that in a sort of sneaky way, and then he's been doing propaganda off the back of it. But it wasn't as though he convinced his whole population that they needed to do it first, and then they all agree and then rally to the cause. It's like he pulls the trigger on it, and then he backs it up after.
Yeah. Yeah, if you're in control and you don't have to worry about opposition, you can pretty much just justify whatever it is you're doing after the fact. You don't necessarily need to have a big build up and convince a bunch of people. Mm-hmm. You can just kind of do what you will and then kind of mitigate potential unrest over that after you start doing it.
Mm-hmm.
So that's very much the authoritarian playbook in a lot of cases. So yeah, West African dictators, similar boat. I did read recently that part of the impetus in Niger's case is that the president, what was his name? President Bazoum. I'm probably mispronouncing it, so my apologies if so. But President Bazoum apparently had a plan to reform the military high command. And as part of that reform, the sitting general in charge of the military, General Chiani, was set to lose his position.
Mm.
And lo and behold, guess who launched the coup not long after the reform was announced?
The general who was going to lose his position.
Yeah. So a little suspicious. Yeah, maybe there's other factors at play, but that seems to be part of the equation at the very least.
Mm-hmm.
So part of the fallout from the coup could be intervention. Not kind of sort of by the West, but not so much directly by the West. I think we've talked about ECOWAS before, have we not?
Someone in chat mentioned it earlier. As a refresher, what is that again?
Let me see if I could. The Economic Community of West African States, I believe is what it's called. I believe is what it stands for. And that's a supranational organization that is nominally dedicated towards furthering the integration of the economies of West Africa. Basically, easing trade barriers between member states in West Africa. Keep in mind that almost all of West Africa had been a part of the French colonial empire in Africa. And, if you look at a map of French West Africa, you can see it's like just one big blob, right? It's one big contiguous territory in northwestern Africa. And while all of those territories were a part of the French Empire, there were effectively no significant barriers to trade between them. That is to say, between the constituent territories in French West Africa. And so after those states became independent, while there were some barriers put up, tariffs and whatnot, there was a desire to try to minimize the degree of economic disruption that would come to established trade in the region. I would add as a caveat that there was not and remains relatively little trade between these territories, just the way the infrastructure in the region is set up. Most of the region's trade is with outside regions, specifically with Europe, China, North America, and other parts of the world. Intra-African trade is not a big part of economic activity in Africa, which is something that economists in the region and outside have complained about many times over the past half century. But anyway, the point here is that they had been integrated economically while a part of the French Empire, and remained so for the most part after independence. And so ECOWAS is basically an institution that is designed to try to preserve that as much as possible. It kind of was created also with some political ambitions as well. It's not just purely about integrating the economies of the region. It also does have nominally, I think maybe even in its charter, an ultimate objective of creating a kind of unified West African government, a kind of federation. That's kind of a long-term stretch goal, though. For now, they're still mostly focused on economic stuff, but they have made some moves towards creating like a parliament for ECOWAS, and also trying to coordinate on issues beyond economic issues. And so that's kind of where ECOWAS comes in here with regard to Niger. One of the norms that West African leaders have tried to put in place is a norm punishing and deterring people from launching coups and overthrowing governments in the region. Now, of course, the reason that was put in place is to try to hold up democratic governments and to try to prevent people from setting up authoritarian governments. That was the stated reason. Probably the real reason is that this, that, or the other autocratic leader wanted to try to prevent people from taking over, from kicking them out of power and taking over in their stead. If you're an established status quo leader, the prospect of a coup is not very appealing. So it makes sense that you would join an organization that has deterring coups as part of its sort of de facto mission statement. So yes, nominally it's about preserving democracy and democratic norms, but there's more than a little bit of self-interest at play there. But liberalism is all about trying to kind of square the circle between individual self-interest and public good. So if being self-interested means they're kind of sort of doing the right thing, all the better. I'll take it. In other words, beggars can't be choosers. So if you have an autocratic governor and he wants to try to prevent coups by joining an institution that nominally wants to preserve democracy, you might as well go with it. So ECOWAS, in turn, has actually gone out of its way to punish people who have launched coups, and has mechanisms in place in order to organize intervention legally by ECOWAS members into member states that have suffered a coup. Yeah, and I think they did actually do that with a member state maybe like 5 to 10 years ago. I'm struggling to remember which one it was. I want to say maybe Ivory Coast. It's been too long. But basically, it is part of the institution, right? So this is another example of them going beyond economic integration, right? This is part of basically policing regional security, which you might not think intuitively would be part of ECOWAS's agenda. But, again, member states want to try to push the organization into new directions in order to kind of expand its writ to include providing stability, not just in economic terms, but also security terms and political terms. So, correspondingly, after Niger's coup, the ECOWAS supranational, sort of leadership condemned the coup, applied sanctions against Niger, and have been talking recently about launching an intervention if the coup leaders do not institute certain reforms in order to restore democracy to Niger. You may recall that Mali had a coup a couple years ago, and ECOWAS took a similar line against them. And while they have subsequently failed, to return the country to democratic governance, Partly it's because they actually had another coup not long after that overthrew the previous coup leaders, but that's another story. But basically, while ECOWAS pressure has not resulted in a return to democracy, it did result in the coup leaders agreeing to a timetable by which they would end up holding elections eventually. Now, again, there was another coup, and so then that kind of reset the timer, and so there were new talks. But ECOWAS has been successful at extracting concessions from these military juntas that have seized power recently. So, it's not entirely wasted effort, basically, is what I'm getting at. They have achieved some success. And by and large, they have not really needed to launch interventions in order to get those concessions. They've been able just to threaten, and that's been enough. That may not be enough with Niger. It's not entirely clear yet. Negotiations are ongoing about, what the new junta will be willing to do in order to try to avoid, a potential intervention. But for the moment, they seem pretty recalcitrant. They don't, the new coup government doesn't seem that interested in creating any kind of timetable for a return to democracy. So ECOWAS has been talking seriously about a military intervention by member states, probably mostly Nigeria, with token forces from other member states. So that could yet happen, but it's particularly of interest to Westerners, or at least it should be. I know nobody cares about Africa, really, in the Western world, but you're going to pay attention now, because the United States and France are actually quite interested in Niger. So this is much more so, mind you, than, say, Mali or, Burkina Faso or Guinea, the other countries that have had coups, over the past couple of years. Niger's of much more interest because there's been a lot more military cooperation over the past 10 years between Niger and the West, specifically France and the United States, than there had been between, Mali and, the others. In fact, the United States has a drone base in Niger, and the French government had, anyway, a not insubstantive deployment of troops in Niger, engaging in counterinsurgent activities. And both the United States and France had been kind of using Niger as a sort of base from which to project power in the region. And when I say project power, mostly that was in the form of assisting states with counterinsurgency. There has been a significant amount of instability in the region that has emerged over the past 10 years and has been steadily getting worse. Part of it is kind of due to climate stuff. A lot of economic activity in the region is herding, you're herding cattle and stuff by semi-nomadic peoples of one kind or another. And because their terrain has been kind of drying out and has become unlivable, basically, for the cattle, they've been increasingly encroaching on lands populated by sedentary farming peoples. And the result has been significant amounts of ethnic tension and ethnic violence. Also, some of that climate stuff has been impacting the farmers themselves. They've found it more and more difficult to productively farm that land on account of persistent droughts and lack of water, lack of rainfall. So that's also created economic dislocation that has fed, especially in the past 5 years, a significant amount of banditry. Basically, people are increasingly turning to crime, extortion, kidnapping, etc., in order to try to make a livelihood in what is an increasingly inhospitable economy in the region, specifically the Sahel. The Sahel has been talked about a lot by national security folks over the past 5 years, especially. So that's created a lot of instability, and that's really feeding a lot of insurgent activity, be it in the form of Islamist activity or just, plain banditry. I know it sounds weird to talk about banditry in the 21st century, but that is a real thing. That is unfortunately has become a major national security threat pretty much across the Sahel at this point. So the United States and France were helping governments try to deal with that. Their results were very mixed. They were really struggling to kind of deliver. Lack of state capacity on the part of partner nations was partly responsible for that. To a degree, lack of professionalism, lack of assets, lack of resources. I mean, the list goes on. Basically, the problem is just much greater than regional actors have been able to address, given their resources. So that led to a certain degree of discontent with Western partners, and that is part of the reason why France and to a lesser degree the United States have kind of fallen out of favor in the region, to the benefit of Russia, which is seen as possibly being a better partner because, obviously they don't complain about democratization and, rule of law and all that stuff. They're willing to just work with regional governments and kind of do things how the regional governments want to do them, regardless of how humanitarian, or not humanitarian those approaches to the problem may be.
Mm-hmm.
It's worth pointing out that in the countries that have been working with Wagner Group to try to deal with insurgent activity of one kind or another in West Africa, they've also had relatively mixed results. There's been some progress in the Central African Republic, but that's mostly just the form of the government successfully taking back territory that had been held by rebels, which is much easier to do than dealing with, insurgency, right? It's one thing to have like a de facto conventional war where you have two relatively equal sides vying for territory. In that case, sending in Western mercenaries will pretty readily tip the scales. But as far as dealing with things like hit and run tactics, guerrilla fighting, smuggling, terrorism, Wagner Group has not delivered quite so well in those particular areas. So we'll see where things go as far as the Wagner Group's ability to maintain popularity over time. But for now, at least, they're free riding on French unpopularity, of which there is a significant degree. Part of that, again, stemming from the lack of progress on counterinsurgency operations in recent times, but also free riding on just the legacy of disenchantment and hatred almost of the French colonial regime, which was in control for, 50 to 100 years, varying from place to place. Not entirely sure how I got onto that, but basically, ECOWAS, that's what it was. The United States and France have an interest in Niger because they had been a significant military partner in the region. And so because they had a special relationship with Niger, and in particular with President Bazoum, there is a particular interest in Washington and Paris in trying to ensure that there is a return to democratic government, as they would phrase it. That's sort of the polite diplomatic way of putting it. Really, they kind of just want their guy back. Mm-hmm. They had a good relationship. They had a good working relationship, I should say, with President Bazoum. He had nominally democratic credentials. He's kind of autocratic in reality. He's not like some lily white, stainless democracy, Democrat in the region. Lots of people have unclean hands in West African politics. But as far as leaders in the region go, he was relatively decent. Mm-hmm. So that kind of gives the West an excuse then to kind of tip the scales a little bit. We're not going to intervene directly. That's extremely unlikely. But if ECOWAS intervenes, they may find themselves and their operation much better resourced than previous such operations. Mm-hmm. There may well be a financial windfall from Washington and Paris, as well as support in the form of intelligence sharing, reconnaissance, maybe even a little air support, depending on what they're willing to allow in the region. Basically, just a lot of little things on the side, not unlike what the United States and the West in general does with Ukraine. Probably on a much smaller scale, but there will probably be interest in that vein in Washington if the ECOWAS intervention goes forward. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's not to say that Niger is considered like a strategic imperative for Washington, but given how badly the region is doing writ large, I suspect that there is a desire to try to maintain at least one relatively stable country in the region, which the United States can partner with in order to try to mitigate any potential future deterioration, or at least mitigate substantive deterioration in the region's security any more than it already has been. Because while you might not know much about West African instability now, if it gets a lot worse and actors like Islamic State move in, you'll get to notice it. And I think, security bureaucrats of one sort or another in Washington are trying very hard to try to prevent that degree from being reached. They're trying to keep a cap on the degree of instability in the region to make sure that it doesn't become newsworthy in the West. Let's put it like that. So given how cheap assistance to an ECOWAS intervention would be in the grand scheme of things, Washington would probably see that cost benefit as worthwhile. Mm-hmm. You help preserve stability in the region, you could get to continue counterinsurgency operations to try to mitigate the expansion of Islamist radicals of one kind or another, and you get to help out a nominally democratic leader in the region. Not a bad deal as far as foreign policy goes. So once that starts, if it starts, you will probably see Niger in the news a lot more. But for now, it's kind of on the back burner. It's just I think people in the West kind of just see it as another unstable African country experiencing problems, which, again, people here don't really see as news. So we'll see. That's definitely something to watch. But for now, yeah, not big news in the West. So there has been some economic fallout. Well, there could be economic fallout. That's another reason it could be in the news. So Niger is a major uranium exporter. And the world's nuclear energy sector, writ large, has already been experiencing problems for two reasons. One, there was a shortage of uranium, apparently. I was reading about that just recently. And also, the war between Russia and Ukraine has put some pressure on nuclear reactor projects in various places. A lot of countries had contracted with Russian producers to build nuclear reactors. Russia is one of the few countries that has the capacity to do that, and has generated a fairly significant amount of money doing so. It's also one of their few major exports. Russian exports are generally, oil and natural gas. And beyond that, lots of weapons, military equipment. And it's a pretty short bench after that in terms of Russian exports. But among them, nuclear. They actually do export a lot of that. So it is kind of important to the Russian government to try to continue to keep that sector healthy in order to generate revenue. But because of the war and all of the sanctions, a lot of their projects have been pretty significantly disrupted, especially on the finance side of things. So, while they are trying to continue doing projects that were already in progress, last I checked, they were finding it a little bit difficult to find new customers. And so that has put a crimp in the pace of the construction and development of new nuclear reactors correspondingly. There are other countries that can do it, China and the United States, obviously, but American producers are seen as slower and more expensive, and China has issues with quality, basically. Their branding isn't quite as good. Let's put it like that. It's something they're working on, but they're not quite there yet. So Russia has kind of been a major market leader there. And corresponding with the sanctions regime, the nuclear sector has kind of taken a hit. So having a major uranium producer like Niger experience geopolitical difficulties, a kind of euphemism, if you like, has definitely not helped things. It's just making the shortage of uranium worse, and is further discouraging investment in nuclear. Not only sort of in Europe, but everywhere. So that's kind of a negative thing. It's not a major economic problem for now. It just kind of depends on how long it lasts. Probably other producers will increase production to try to make up for shortfalls if they do last. But when a major producer is knocked offline, invariably that's going to create short to medium term waves. Other producers can increase production, but it's going to take time in order to completely replace Niger production if there is a prolonged shortfall owing to sanctions or civil war, or God knows what else might be happening there that would disrupt supply. But regardless, if things do get more complicated, the nuclear sector will feel it even more. So that's also something else to watch. Short-term pain, open question long-term. We'll see. But during the whole green transition that we've got going on right now, not particularly helpful in the grand scheme of things. So you can kind of consider that an indirect impact. It'll slow the green transition to a degree, in so much as nuclear is a critical component of that. So yeah, some interesting stuff going on in West Africa. That's the long and short of it.
So with the military having control, how do they govern? Do they have a plan? Is it just the general is now the dictator if they don't care about democracy?
So to a degree, the coup was popular because the government was a little lacking in legitimacy. Again, President Bazoum was a little bit autocratic, but also corrupt. There was a lack of economic growth. There was a lack of progress there was just a lot of problems. So when the coup happened, a lot of people in Niger were actually kind of okay with it. And so even though the government has not come out and said, okay, we're going to return to democracy by such and such date, this is a popular revolt and I'm going to rule on behalf of the people now, that hasn't happened. But people are kind of willing to give him a chance just because they didn't have much hope with the previous government, and they want to see what the new guy can do. So effectively, yeah, actually, he has just seized power for himself, and he is just dictator, of Niger. Relatively little effort has been expended to try to justify it or to try to legitimize it. So right now, kind of like I said earlier, he's basically free riding on disenchantment with the status quo. He could stay in power with popular support if he is able to substantively address some of those problems. But if it's true that he principally just seized power because he was about to lose his job, I'm extremely skeptical that's going to happen. Yeah, that's a pretty self-interested reason to launch a coup. If he was just a frustrated bureaucrat, a civil servant who genuinely believed that he knew best how to solve the country's problems and that the established leadership was just getting in the way of that, maybe I would think that there was a chance he could solve those problems and retain popular support. But as is, he just seems like a self-interested political actor.
You know what's wrong with the governance in Niger right now? Me getting fired. And I'm here to change that.
Yeah, well, that's at least one problem solved in the public policy realm. So, credit for that. But I'm a little skeptical he's going to be able to improve the economy and deal with security problems and all the other stuff that bedeviled the previous government.
That's one of those unique problems that only happens in high-level government hirings and firings. Most of the time when people think about who they're going to fire next, they're not worried about that person launching a coup and then taking over the whole company in response to it. But for a military general, that can be the case because they already have all the connections and the strings to work on that.
Yeah. And they've got the control over the country's monopoly on violence. So if they want to turn that on the government, not much civilian leadership can do about it.
Yep.
So some fun trivia about the coup in Niger. Maybe it's not fun, but it is weird. At first, the presidential bodyguard actually just imprisoned the president. And there was some question about whether or not the coup was actually just the presidential bodyguard. The army came out and said that, they condemned it and they weren't going to, and they wanted them to stop, et cetera. And then it came out later that it was actually a plan by the army itself. Again, that general.
Oh, we don't condone this kidnapping. This was very wrong. This man should be very in trouble. But by the way, could you just hold him there, keep holding him there for a little bit while longer, just in case,
Yeah. Yeah, at first I thought it was just the presidential bodyguard, and maybe it may have just been a personal dispute over pay or something. That actually happened in Ethiopia, where some army, what was it? I think it was some soldiers in the capital got upset that they hadn't been paid, and they actually raided the presidential palace and confronted Prime Minister Abe, which the prime minister then diffused by challenging them to push-ups, which worked. They just started doing push-ups, and he talked to them, and then they went away. So some maxed out charisma skills there for Prime Minister Abe in Ethiopia.
Wow.
Well, I'm afraid no amount of push-ups were going to solve the coup in Niger. And I doubt President Bazoum is in much physical condition to do it anyway. He's kind of an older guy. But regardless, the thing that I thought was weird, besides the fact that the presidential guard kind of started it, is that they actually allowed him to continue to post on social media. You would think that they would cut him off completely from communication to try to mitigate the likelihood that he was to organize a counter coup or something to that effect. But no, the whole time the coup was happening, the president/former president was just posting on Twitter, and on social media about how the coup was illegal and that he requested foreign actors to intervene to restore him to power.
Help me! I'm tweeting to you from the toilet of my jail cell. I require aid.
Yeah, he's actually made an official request for the United States, France, and ECOWAS to intervene in Niger to restore democracy and end the coup. So that has actually been cited as a potential casus belli, on the part of neighboring states and interested parties in the West. So don't be surprised if you see that mentioned, if there is some kind of intervention. But it seems that the coup plotters in Niger are not very good at coups because, cutting off the previous leader from all communication should be really easy. That's just intuitive. But for whatever reason, they were just like, no, we don't need to do that.
Yeah, it's fine. Let him cook.
What's the worst he could do? Well, we'll see. We shall see.
Tweet aggressively.
Well, to be fair, it worked for Recep Erdogan, right?
Yeah.
You remember that coup attempt back in the day?
Remind me?
2016, I want to say. There was that brief military coup attempt. It wasn't the entire military, but basically it was Gulenists, as Erdogan called them. These people who were a part of an extended network of graduates of a sort of moderately Islamist school system in Turkey. They'd networked together in the military, among other places, and decided that they were going to try to stage a coup to overthrow Erdogan. And it failed. Too small, bad planning. A lot of things went wrong, really. But they were able to more or less successfully marginalize Erdogan. He basically had to go into hiding, and it wasn't clear who was in charge of the government, and maybe it was kind of touch and go as to maybe it might succeed. But then Erdogan got onto, what was it? He got onto some social media. I don't remember exactly what it was, but he got onto social media and started posting about he was still the legitimate president and that the people need to hit the streets in order to protest this coup and to ensure that democracy is respected. And a lot of his followers especially responded to that. And there were protests that followed. And it was clear at that point that even if there was a coup in progress, the military was not fully in control, and the president still had some degree of independence such that he could try to retain control over the government. So his effort, even though it was relatively minor, just basically shitposting online, worked. It helped restore confidence amongst his followers that no, the coup had not fully succeeded and there was still a chance to stop it. So cutting leaders off from social media is fairly important, right? Leadership, if it has sufficient political acumen, can organize a response either by powerful elites within government or by way of popular support amongst the people.
I'm just imagining a modern skit of, "Sire, they're at the gates. They're going to overthrow the whole government and the military's outside. What should we do?" Give me a few minutes. I'm just going to shitpost for a little bit and see if we can, get the people on our side. Okay.
All right. Yeah, it sounds goofy, but it can work. It just depends on how much popular support you have. Yeah, I don't think President Bazoum in Niger is going to be able to do that, but in Turkey they did. And to kind of underline that point, the issue during a coup is uncertainty. Generally coup plotters will go after mass communication in order to try to mitigate any potential counter-coup plotting by the actors being overthrown. So communication is very important in that sense. And what happens is that a lot of local political actors, lower-level officials, bureaucrats, etc., will just not know what's happening. And because they don't know what's happening, they don't know if there's potential to stop the coup, right? For all you know, the coup may have already succeeded. You may not have even found out about it until well after the fact on account of communications being disrupted. So, while you may want to take action, you may want to hit the streets or try to mobilize something, it may be for nothing. And nobody wants to die for a lost cause, right? So coup plotters frequently count on uncertainty to try to discombobulate and disorient their opponents in order to prevent any kind of backlash. So the revolution of the internet kind of undermines that significantly, because now it's virtually impossible to stop people getting online. It's extremely difficult. You have to use really extensive controls. You have to basically just shut down all the routers in order to make that work. And even then, there are ways around it. And so that access to communication is what allowed Erdogan to kind of dispel that uncertainty and make it clear it's not over. There's still time. We can stop this, which they did. So yeah, communications and uncertainty, those are key factors in any case of political unrest, I guess is a mild way of putting it. But before we get too much deeper, I'm going to throw out the usual disclaimer before I forget. I'm not an expert in everything I talk about on here. More painfully obvious at some times than others. So if I ever say anything wrong, stupid, or biased, please let me know. If I'm wrong, I want to know more than anybody. Participation by Chad is encouraged in that regard. I don't read chat while we do this, but I will see it later. I always go back and read through it and enjoy the feedback. Or alternatively, the raging arguments that break out in chat. We get that a lot too.
Scathing reviews, yes. Yeah, there are certain buzzwords that get certain people activated, which I don't need to say them, but one of them is the name of a presidential candidate, and the other one is the name of the other presidential candidate. Yep. And the outrage media, I feel like they really like to focus on that because it's very simple. It's the ad hominem of to the man of talking shit and like who's stronger, who's better. It really works well with the like kind of primate mindset of who should be the big gorilla in town kind of thing. But in the US, we do it a little bit different. It's not about who the largest gorilla is. It's about the oldest gorilla. And we vote for the oldest person to be in.
Well, was there any other sexy business for us?
Oh, there's a lot of sexy business, but we do have some questions in the Discord.
Let's see. Yeah, we do. Okay. Does it look like ECOWAS will still intervene even after Nigeria's Senate voted down the request for troop deployment? No, I haven't seen that. Well, Nigeria is definitely the 800-pound gorilla in West African affairs. So if they don't do it, that makes it much less likely. But I don't know that a failed vote in the Senate is going to be enough to stop it. Probably there's going to be some negotiations, I would guess. I guess it also kind of depends on how much the government wants to do it. It's not as though Nigeria doesn't have plenty of other problems right now. So I'm sure a foreign intervention is probably not high on their list of priorities, given their own problems with insecurity and instability, especially in the north of the country. The Sahel runs through northern Nigeria, so all of those problems with banditry and insurgent activity, all of that is impacting northern Nigeria, as well as places like Mali, Burkina Faso, Central African Republic, etc. So, I'm sure they would prefer to focus on that rather than going on some, big foreign adventure of one kind or another. But at the same time, the reason that I would think that they would be more inclined to do it, even in spite of that fact, is that the Nigerian government does have broader ambition for the region, rather than just their own self-interest. It's kind of part of their self-interest. Nigeria sees West Africa as kind of being, their neighborhood. Nigeria is the most powerful country in the region, and so there is a sense in Nigeria, in the Nigerian capital anyway, maybe not among the people, that there is kind of a special prerogative on the part of the Nigerian government to kind of take the lead in regional affairs. To one degree or another. I'm not saying they want to dominate the region, but they kind of dominate it anyway, regardless, just by the sheer size of the country.
Yeah, their population is way higher than those two, right?
Oh, it's higher than all of the other countries in the region combined.
Oh, okay. So yeah,
easily, yeah. The average population of a country in West Africa is 5 to 10 million people, in that range, and then Nigeria has around probably 200 million. So considerably larger. Mm-hmm. So, they've got the heft and they've got the economy to sort of lead regional affairs. But given their own problems, there may be some deterrent there to intervening. But I think probably the country's president will try to take some action to some degree. They've already imposed sanctions, so that's pretty significant in and of itself, given the importance of the Nigerian economy in West Africa. But it's still quite possible, I would think, that there could still be an intervention. But I should point out that I don't know a whole lot about Nigerian politics or procedure. So it could be that this is a significant setback. I would have to read more. Mm. Let's see. Is Prigozhin a non-entity for Russian political scene? Since? I think you mean scene. Is Prigozhin a non-entity for the Russian political scene for the foreseeable future? So here's the thing about Prigozhin. He was pretty much already a political non-entity. Obviously the pseudo-coup thing kind of cast that into doubt. It made it seem like he might actually be important, but then he basically just folded like immediately. So it seems like that was more just theater than anything. So really, I think the original reading of Prigozhin as a loudmouth lackey of Putin was probably pretty accurate. Maybe he had more ambitions than that, but it seems like whatever ambitions he has, he's going to pursue within the rubric of intra-patronage politics within the leading patronage network in Russia, that being Vladimir Putin's patronage network. So he doesn't seem like an actual threat at this point. He's just a troublemaker, basically, who is playing politics really hard, which might sound strange to people who live in more stable countries. Playing politics hard in a place like Western Europe or the United States means that you're kind of going after your opponents, putting pressure on them, using the bully pulpit, as we would say here in the United States, at least in terms of presidential such behavior. But if you live in an authoritarian country, they have like real court intrigue type politics. It's not about maneuvering as far as getting public support. It's not about being good at your job or public policy or that kind of stuff. Playing politics in an authoritarian system means that you're appealing for the attention of people already in powerful positions. If you can gain the favor of the powerful, that's how you advance. That is the main way that you do that. And that can be very cutthroat. Historically speaking, it's always been cutthroat, but it still is. It's just more low key now than it used to be. So, one of the ways that you can advance is to try to make somebody already powerful look bad. Well, maybe not already powerful. Let me rephrase that. You can take somebody who is a lower level official in somebody else's patronage network, make them look bad, and try to get that more powerful person in that network to appoint you to that position. And that's all the more common if you are already in that network, right? The other people who are kind of at an equal level in a patronage network are your rivals. And if you can make them look bad, then that's one less person who you have to compete with for a promotion to a higher level of the patronage network. Also, if you can remove other people and people allied with other people, other rivals in the patronage network, you can fill those positions with people who are loyal to you. The more people who are loyal to you within a patronage network, the more likely you are to get a favorable outcome, because the more power you have within that network to get to the leader of that network deliverables of one kind or another. So basically, it's just people kind of building organized criminal networks. That's kind of what it comes down to. Whoever can be the biggest mob boss ends up the most powerful. So obviously, that's very cutthroat. It could be very violent. Prigozhin is doing that. When he was doing the coup thing, he was not going after Putin, near as we can tell. He was going after rivals within the patronage network, that being principally Gerasimov and the other guy. I forget the other guy's name. But the military leadership of Russia were the people he was trying to discredit, and probably he was hoping he could get a deal where he or one of his people would be installed in those positions, with corresponding benefits to his own position within the extended patronage network. And presumably that would incur some kind of long-term benefit, greater wealth, greater power, maybe more benefits whenever Putin dies and the shuffle for a replacement happens, which is going to be exciting. I'm extremely skeptical there's any kind of succession plan in place for Vladimir Putin. So there could very easily be a succession crisis. So, a lot of political actors are probably, positioning themselves for that. Prigozhin is just doing so in a louder and dumber way than what a lot of his peers are probably already doing. But that said, he's not really like a major actor. He's loud, he's very present on social media, but his actual ability to influence outcomes seems pretty limited at this point. Let's see. Is the fact that Jefferson acted with more power than he thought the federal government, quote unquote, should have evidence that he was hypocritical in that area? Why did Jefferson and his party oppose the Haitian Revolution? Let's see. So 2 questions. First part, is that evidence that he was hypocritical in that area? Yes, to a degree, but I don't think it was like an authentic hypocrisy. Like, I don't think he only said that he was against large government because it benefited him personally or whatnot. Like, I think he genuinely believed that. And the historical record pretty well bears that out. I think Jefferson, though, was not just a liberal, but also a realist. If there is a deal out there that maybe is in conflict with your personal beliefs as far as politics and the role of government, but which offers a major, significant economic and strategic benefit for your country, I mean, the realist argument is that you should do it, make it happen. I mean, it's hard to say no to that. And the results speak for themselves. Like, it's not as though that territory has not been of immense benefit to the United States. I mean, it's effectively a core part of the country. I don't think anybody would think of something like the American Midwest, for example, or the Mississippi, or the broader, Western U.S. as anything but core constituent parts of the country. So, Jefferson had the foresight to see that potential and act on it. So, yeah, it was a hypocritical move, but I don't think it reflects a deeper hypocrisy on the part of Jefferson himself. I think he just saw the cost benefit and decided to pull the trigger. And, to be fair, it's not as though people could not have tried to sabotage it. Congress could have stepped in and said, hey, that's unconstitutional. You can't do that. But as was after the fact, people looked at the deal and said, it's a little bit bullshit, but okay, we're going to let that slide.
Yeah, one of the things about idealism is a person who's an idealist isn't necessarily idealistic all the time, and they don't necessarily follow that belief to the letter with every action their whole life. Being open to exceptions to the rule is a big part of what discretion is overall. Some examples are just cases where someone did something wrong and you let it slide and you give them a warning because you figure it's going to be a teaching moment, that sort of thing. And a lot of that humanizes the whole process of how we interact with each other. So discretion is good. If you don't have any principles or ideals for anything, you're kind of just a blob of self-interest. So that's kind of the extreme on the other end. And then the other end is people who are idealistic and they have so much fervor that they can't even communicate with people on the other side. And that has some downsides to it as well. So you could almost do a 0 to 10 scale of idealism to just realism, or I guess self-interestedness. I'm not sure the exact 0 point of what you would call that, but Thomas Jefferson wouldn't be a 10. You could say each of those decisions that he made that was different from his main stance, such as he believed the executive branch should not be too strong, but he did make a big decision as the executive, that would bump him down. So instead of being a 10 out of 10 idealist and reformer, maybe he's a 9 or an 8 or something, where he definitely made big change and he definitely challenged a lot of status quo of the time, but he didn't perfectly align with those kind of defining attributes all the time. And most people don't. So it's important whenever you're looking at historical figures to not get too wrapped up in the hero worship. The further back in time you go, the more often you can forget a lot of the mistakes that these people made as well, and how they were flawed human beings just like anyone who's alive today.
Yeah, I concur. Yeah, Jefferson certainly has been in for some hero worship. There has been kind of a turn, kind of a backlash against that more recently, especially since 2020. There's been a lot more focus on Jefferson, the slave owner, rather than Jefferson, the philosopher.
Yeah.
I didn't mention that earlier, but Jefferson was a Southerner. He was born in Virginia, and he owned a relatively large plantation with a not insignificant number of slaves. And he himself also bore several children by one of his female slaves. I think her name was Sally something. Don't remember her full name. Mm-hmm. But I think it was later proved through genetic testing that he had a pretty significantly sized lineage from his relations with that particular slave.
Mm-hmm.
So that kind of gets to the core of America as a country of contradictions, because, on the one hand, a lot of our leading early figures were big proponents of liberalism and representative governance and were revolutionaries of their time, and yet at the same time owned slaves, which is very contradictory. Liberalism and self-government do not really jibe well with the ownership of other humans as things, as property. And so that was one of the contradictions that was basically just baked in. To be fair, that wasn't the whole country. The New England and the Atlantic states were much less dependent on slavery by that point and had relatively few by comparison. But it can't be denied that a lot of the major leaders of the early revolution, and certainly some of the most important philosophical contributors to the ideological underpinning of the revolution, were Southerners, Thomas Jefferson probably being the foremost of them. Mm-hmm. And that was a contradiction, again, to be fair, that was a contradiction Jefferson himself struggled with. He himself did not have a high opinion of slavery, and yet he kept his slaves, right? He could have freed them anytime he wanted. Mm-hmm. That was the thing you could do back then. Slavery was legal, but as a slave owner, you could free your slaves. And what happened is that a lot of otherwise well-meaning liberal Southerners who owned slaves would frequently hang on to them, dependent as they were on their labor for their economic livelihood. The trade-off that they would make, the compromise they would make, is that while they would keep them, what they would do is that they put in their will after they died that they should be freed once they were gone, which is not very satisfying. As a third-party observer, looking back, you would kind of prefer that he be a little more proactive, take on a little more risk. Like, yeah, your livelihood is predicated on plantation labor and whatnot, but
yeah, it's basically saying the person doesn't stand against it enough to make the change now, but I'm going to cause my future generations to make that change, and they'll deal with the consequences of that economic flow shift. Yeah, it's interesting, too, when you think about from the modern lens, and obviously we see the world way differently than people saw it back then, but one of the things is just from a millennial kid's perspective, like, you could just free them and offer them a job where if you need those kind of skills, maybe you just make less money. For someone like Thomas Jefferson, I would think that he would be fairly well off if he's involved in the highest level of U.S. government and stuff, and you could afford to still have the same operations around you, but you just pay your people. I guess it was just like something that people wouldn't even think to do back then. I don't really know.
As far as slavery?
Yeah, just switch from slaves to paid labor. Like,
what's the big deal? Yeah, so that kind of goes beyond the realm of just the economics of slavery, because as you point out, well, as you implicitly have just pointed out, slavery as an economic system basically obsolesced in the 1700s. Mm-hmm. And, a lot of the political discourse around slavery, which even then was, pretty well turning against slavery, even in the South, interestingly, a lot of the discourse centered around the fact that slavery just seemed to be on its way out regardless. Like, it just wasn't like a moneymaker anymore. It wasn't necessary either, because there was obviously just enough labor, given economic activity. So why even bother? It just seemed like it seemed like the easiest way to deal with slavery as an institution, the path of least resistance, as it were, was just to let it die out of its own accord. As it becomes more and more economical, more and more people will free the slaves. So rather than going through the politically difficult effort of trying to ban it and to try to satisfy everybody who had sunk a bunch of money into their slaves and stood to lose money by freeing them, rather than dealing with the thorny politics of that issue, just let it die out over time. Let's just not bother. It's a problem that solves itself. Mm-hmm. And then the cotton gin was invented. And then everything was fucked. There's your historical term of the day. It was fucked. Because what happened is that the cotton gin created a huge amount of new demand for cotton. And with that huge amount of new demand came a resurrection, as it were, of slavery as an institution. While it hadn't really been that profitable, given the low prices you could get for the goods slaves were producing, suddenly the goods that slaves were producing, principally cotton, suddenly were very valuable. And so that meant that there was a new lease on life for slavery. And it kind of caught people off guard. They weren't really expecting that. And, as I said, that pretty well screwed over the expected timeline for how slavery would be dealt with. So now, not only did they have to deal with the fact that slavery was economically viable, they also had to deal with the fact that they didn't really have an incentive to get rid of it. Right? So that made it extremely difficult to unfuck slavery, in the American political economy. And, we all saw how that turned out. Not well.
Civil War was the most violent war in history for the U.S. per person.
Yeah. I've said it before. I'll say it again. More Americans died in the U.S. Civil War than all other American wars combined. Pretty
So,
nasty.
cotton gin question is the reason that it increased the demand for slavery again because it shifted the bottleneck, where before the bottleneck was in converting the kind of raw cotton into a usable product to, okay, now we can produce it super fast. Now we need to be able to get more of the raw stuff.
Exactly. Yeah, that's exactly it. Yeah, I mean, before it was very difficult to take the cotton and pick out all the seeds and basically refine it into something that textiles producers could use, that they could spin into yarn or spin into cloth or whatever they wanted to do with it. Cotton gin made that very simple.
Mm.
Yeah. And also, the fact that the cotton gin was prevalent in the South kind of belies the notion that slaves were unskilled. This is a side note. This is a tangent, I guess. We do a lot of these. But yeah, people kind of think of slaves as basically just cotton pickers. They go out into the field, they pick cotton, whatever. They're not really skilled laborers. Not so. Actually, slaves knew their shit, right? They were very good carpenters. They knew how to build shit, whatnot. They knew how to farm. They had life skills, right? They knew what they were doing. A lot of them actually, especially in the 1600s, were very valuable because they were seen as skilled farmers. Like originally, one of the reasons that slaves were imported into the United States was for rice farming, and rice was a not insignificant export out of the British colonies in North America over the course of the 1600s. But Europeans didn't know shit about rice production, or at least not much. Certainly not British Europeans. So what they would do is what they would do rather is go to West Africa and pay a very high premium for slaves who knew how to farm rice. That was seen as a skilled trade, and they paid through the nose for it. And they brought a lot of people over to do exactly that, and they made pretty decent money doing so. So in the case of the cotton gin, it wasn't just that it created a lot more demand for people in fields picking cotton. The slaves themselves would work the cotton gin, right? They were doing what was effectively factory work. And that was actually one of the reasons that anti-slavery really kind of took off after slavery became economically viable again. It wasn't just moral outrage. It was also a sense that slavery was a potential alternative model of industrialization. The Southerners were talking and thinking about setting up factories that were worked just by slaves. It wasn't just going to be a plantation thing. And Northerners, being pro-labor as they were, really, really fucking hated that. Mm-hmm. Not just for moral reasons, but because they knew that, economically speaking, factories worked by slaves would invariably have a cost advantage over factories worked by free labor, as it was called at the time. Now, of course, you can get into the economics of that and point out that slave labor is invariably going to be less productive than free labor. That's also true. So it could have been that slave labor factories would not have actually been competitive with free labor factories for that reason. But free labor proponents did not want to find out the hard way. They didn't want to give them the chance. So there was a big, increasingly loud push to ban slavery or otherwise curb it correspondingly. So that's an example of how moral debates often have an economic component to them. It wasn't just slavery is wrong because owning people is wrong. It's slavery is wrong because if it succeeds, then I'm not going to be able to compete. That was also part and parcel of that whole early 19th century debate over free labor versus slave labor.
Yeah, so it's another example of a selfish reason that ended up helping a selfless cause.
Yeah, exactly.
So, a similar example, kind of tying things together, the coup that we talked about recently, motivated by, there's some lack of legitimacy for the government. The people are kind of disgruntled and they want change. So the general who's about to be out of a job, he has a selfish reason for it, but the people are kind of backing him up on this because they see a potential benefit, or at least an alternative option for them.
Yeah, it could have it could have benefits for the public if the new government actually follows through on some of the popular measures that the public wants.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so in that sense, he would be doing a public service. Maybe not so much by overthrowing a democratically elected government, but in so much as public policy is actually reflecting the will of the public, that would be beneficial, even if he was doing it for self-interested reasons. So, as you say. But again, I doubt he's going to do that. Very skeptical. But if he did, you would be correct. Well, that's the first part of the question. The second part of the question was, why did Jefferson and his party oppose the Haitian Revolution? Well, we kind of already answered that, right? As a slave owner, Jefferson and like-minded, slave-owning Southerners were not thrilled at the idea of a successful slave revolt overthrowing a plantation political economy. That kind of boded ill well for their own potential livelihood, if not their lives. Slave owners don't generally make out well in slave revolts. The former slaves don't particularly appreciate their treatment and often take it out on them. So slave owners in the United States were very, very nervous when the Haitian Revolution happened, and even more nervous when it succeeded. And there was a big desire to try to mitigate the spread of the news about the Haitian Revolution to ensure American slaves never even learned about it. There was a big fear that if they did learn about it, they might get ideas and that they might try to organize something similar. I would add that this kind of exacerbated the debate about slavery in the United States. Free labor was already going pretty hard in terms of condemning slave-owning Southerners. And so when the Haitian Revolution happened and the Northerners kind of went out and kind of teased the South about it to a degree, the Southerners came out and said, oh, well, you want this to happen. You want these people to come and kill us. And the North was like, well, kind of, maybe. So that did not help tensions within domestic American politics. It definitely added a degree of partisan rancor that was not helpful. But yeah, that's basically it. Jefferson was not a big fan for that reason. Although I've never read anything specific that said he opposed it in principle. I don't know how opposed Jefferson was to the Haitian Revolution. But in general, Southern plantation owners were extremely skeptical, especially the ones that were heavily pro-slavery. Mm-hmm. As a political actor, that itself probably necessitated a certain degree of public skepticism by Jefferson. But again, I don't know what he himself really believed about it. That's another example of contradictions. As a proponent of liberal democracy, Jefferson should have come out and supported it, but political realities in the United States very much mitigated that possibility. Mm. There was basically no way that was going to happen.
He was going to help them with that issue, but it would have been bad for his personal business and situations. So, yeah.
Yeah, it's not good for one's political career to piss off your constituents when their livelihood is threatened, however deserved that threatening may have been. So if I ever don't or fail to answer a question satisfactorily, feel free to ask again. I'm a little bit dumb sometimes, so if I miss the crux of a question, just ask me again. I'm happy to return to it. But that's all we had for questions for now. I think we actually did have some older questions. Let me see. Oh, yeah. It's been a while since we've done. It's been like, 3 weeks?
Yep, that sounds about right.
Sounds about right. Yeah, so the last time we did this, we talked about Vietnam, right?
Yep.
Yeah, that's the one. So there was a question there about Vietnam leading, the history of Vietnam leading up to the war. This was from a poster, A Colony of Ants. Mm-hmm. I don't know if they're on now or not, but they asked about it. But then they also asked about how the U.S. managed to normalize relations after the war with Vietnam. And I totally forgot that part of the question over the course of talking about the history of Vietnam. And somebody in chat mentioned it later, and we kind of moved on, but somebody in chat mentioned, actually, I'm quite curious about that. So 3 weeks later, here's your answer. I don't know if they're still interested or here to see it, but yeah, we'll finish this guy's question, the second part of his question. How did the United States normalize relations with Vietnam after the Vietnam War? The answer is very anticlimactic and probably unsatisfying. It's not a sexy answer. Basically, both sides were quite happy to move on. The United States government had lost a lot of legitimacy in domestic American politics because of the Vietnam War. People in the United States hated the war. everybody here basically just wanted it to be over and to move on. They wanted to just put it behind them. So there wasn't like a lot of rancor in the U.S. against Vietnam. Obviously there was a lot of people that didn't like the Communist Party in Vietnam. That remains true today. But be that as it may, as far as diplomacy and foreign relations, the U.S. government was like, whatever, fuck it. 10 years, untold billions of dollars, tens of thousands of dead, came to nothing. And that's a bad look for anybody. So the attitude in the U.S. government was that it was a lost cause and that it would be better to move on. So for maybe 10 some years after the end of the Vietnam War, actually more like 10 to 15 years, relations between the United States and Vietnam were basically limited to maneuvering over the proxy war in Cambodia. Have you heard of that? I think we've talked a little bit about it before.
I don't really remember that well.
French Indochina as a whole experienced a lot of tumult after basically the end of French colonial rule in the region. So French Indochina was Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, those three countries, and they all became independent in the 1950s. And so, the Vietnam is the most famous of them. Obviously, the Vietnam War and the Indochina War kind of made headlines. But Laos and Cambodia have their own drama, very closely tied to the Vietnam War, as it were. Laos, in particular, had a whole last civil war that ran parallel and intersected with the Vietnam War and involved a considerable amount of CIA intervention. Cambodia was a little different. They were actually neutral during the Vietnam War. That was the official position of the king of Cambodia. They actually had a king. And nobody really cared. I mean, when I say nobody cared, I mean that everybody violated their neutrality like regularly. So, the Vietnamese communists, specifically the Viet Minh and the Viet Cong, they actually ran the Ho Chi Minh Trail, the supply chain that sent goods and weapons from North Vietnam to South Vietnam. They ran that just right through eastern Cambodia. And the Cambodian government's attitude was, well, we don't want them to do that, but we don't really feel like we could do anything about it without getting involved in the war, which we don't want to do. So we're just going to pretend that's not happening. So you can imagine how that went with the U.S. government. Washington was not amused and put a not insignificant amount of pressure on the Cambodian government to actually recognize what was in front of their face and to cooperate with the United States government to try to do something about it. And the Cambodian government continued to refuse to do so. So their neutrality was not like a true neutrality. It was more like a very risk-averse, ambivalent neutrality. Like, effectively, they were involved in so much as their territory was being used to propagate the war. But officially, and in terms of the Cambodian state itself, they were staying out of it, which lasted right up until the coup. Yeah, the region was very unstable at that time. So the issue is that while the king of Cambodia wanted to keep the country out of the war, the fact that the Vietnamese were using their territory without their permission was actually very controversial amongst Cambodian nationalists. I don't know how many of you guys know about this, forgive me if so, but the fact is that there is a not inconsiderable amount, I'm using that phrase a lot tonight, there was a not inconsiderable amount of ethnic tension between Cambodians and Vietnamese, and that's a historical thing. For those of you who don't know, Vietnam actually, back in the medieval period, I want to say like the 1300s, invaded Cambodia and seized a whole bunch of its territory. If you ever look at a picture of Vietnam on a map, well, not a picture, if you look at Vietnam on a map, it kind of has a weird shape, right? It's kind of this long, thin country. So the reality is that Vietnam originally was basically just the northern half of what is currently Vietnam. Actually, probably more like the northern third. So the southern third of present-day Vietnam was originally a part of Cambodia, right? That whole delta region, right? The delta of the Mekong River was all a part of a single Khmer kingdom, right? A single Cambodian kingdom. I think the middle third was actually Polynesian, weirdly enough. That was a much smaller kingdom. So what happened is that around the medieval period, I don't remember the exact century, but basically the Vietnamese kingdom decided to expand south, and they took over the Polynesian kingdom, and then they invaded Cambodia and were able to successfully conquer the Delta region. And ever since then, Cambodians and Vietnamese have not been on the best of terms, by and large. What happened is that Cambodia declined, and so that didn't really matter so much from the Vietnamese perspective. That is to say, the tension between them didn't matter so much. But Thailand was also ascendant in that period. So what happened is that Cambodia basically became a battlefield over which Vietnamese and Thai armies, fought each other for broader control of that region between Vietnam and Thailand, which lasted for a good while until the French came in and kind of turned Cambodia into a puppet kingdom, then incorporated it into French Indochina. So later on, when they became independent, the king again wanted to be neutral, but the people were still kind of iffy on Vietnam and Vietnamese. And so when the Viet Cong started just running running supplies through their territory without their permission, a lot of Cambodian nationalists were really angry about it and wanted the government to do something, which, as I said, it refused to do. So that tension in which pressure was being heaped on the Cambodian state by the Viet Cong and the United States government and Cambodian nationalists eventually resulted in the coup. And the new nationalist coup government wanted to fuck with the Vietnamese, specifically with the Viet Cong in the eastern part of the country. Obviously, Washington was delighted. They were quite happy to provide support for that adventure. But by that point, it was really late in the war, and the U.S. was drawing down. And so not much really ended up coming of it. However, it did give the Viet Cong an excuse to intervene in Cambodia. So before, they'd pretty much just been running supply lines. After the coup and the nationalist government in Cambodia that came to power started effectively fighting with the Viet Cong started pushing back. And more to the point, they started supporting or lending much more support than they had been to a group called the Khmer Rouge. I think it's Khmer Rouge. I never can remember exactly. In English, we always call them the Khmer Rouge.
That's how it's spelled, yeah.
Yeah. So the Khmer Rouge were basically Cambodia's Communist Party. And Vietnam's communists started supporting them in an effort to try to deflect pressure from the Cambodian nationalists. And, that worked. Eventually the Viet Minh and the Viet Cong, basically the NVA, the North Vietnamese Army, was able to win the Vietnam War, incorporate the South. They and their proxies were able to defeat anti-communist forces in Laos and in the Laos Civil War in favor of the communists. And that basically left Cambodia. And so they did exactly that. They supported the Khmer Rouge. They came to power, defeated the anti-communist forces. And the result was extremely weird. Southeast Asia is always interesting. So what happened is that the king of Cambodia fled the country and went into exile in, wait for it, the People's Republic of China. Very counterintuitive choice until you consider that the People's Republic of China was on very bad terms with the Vietnamese communists. The reason being that the Vietnamese communists preferred the Soviet Union as partner rather than China. Keep in mind that, even before the Vietnam War really started, but certainly by the end of the Vietnam War, the Sino-Soviet split was a big reality in terms of international relations. So while all communists, be they pro-China or pro-Soviet, supported the Vietnamese in their war effort, after the war was over, there was a bit of a dispute. The Vietnamese preferred the Soviets. The Chinese were very resentful of that fact, and that manifested as a war between China and Vietnam in 1979, which the Vietnamese actually won pretty handily. Maybe no surprise, given the degree of experience they had to offer relative to the Chinese army. Regardless, that just illustrates how bad tensions were. Now, here's the thing. The Vietnamese supported the Khmer Rouge at first, but the Khmer Rouge were actually Maoists. And while that was not too big a deal at first, when the Vietnamese were focused on fighting the Americans, after the war ended, it became a bigger issue. And increasingly, the Khmer Rouge became a proxy for the Chinese. And especially when the war in 1979 happened, that was not really acceptable to Vietnam. So here's some trivia for you. the Vietnamese government and the Vietnamese Communist Party considers the broader French Indochina, or the former French Indochina, Laos, Cambodia, etc., as being their sphere of influence. All of those territories they see as kind of their backyard, and they think they have, to a degree, a special prerogative, or maybe just privilege, to intervene in the affairs of those nations, given that they are important to the strategic security of Vietnam. So Laos was locked down, Cambodia was not. And when the Khmer Rouge made it increasingly apparent that they were not going to get along with the new Vietnamese government, both because that was the nationalist thing to do in Cambodia, but also because of their respective alignments in the Sino-Soviet split, the Vietnamese government in the early 1980s, I want to say, launched an outright intervention. They actually invaded Cambodia and tried to overthrow the Khmer Rouge regime, which they did successfully. However, while they were successful in overthrowing the Khmer Rouge government, they were not able to stop them from starting a guerrilla war. And what followed, somewhat ironically, given the nature of the Vietnam War, was a 10-year counterinsurgency fought by a puppet Cambodian government with the support of Vietnamese army units against Khmer Rouge guerrilla fighters fighting against them. And again, that conflict ranged the length and breadth of the 1980s. And it didn't end until basically the early 90s, I think, maybe late 80s, when a peace agreement was hashed out with the support of the United Nations. It was a pretty grueling fight, and it created some weird alliances. I already mentioned the king of Cambodia and how he ran off to the People's Republic of China. That was a viable choice for him at the time, given the geopolitics. And he actually stayed there as a guest of the People's Republic of China, I think, for the rest of his life, if I'm not mistaken. Well, no, not the rest of his life. He came back when the peace treaty was signed, ending the war between the Khmer Rouge and the Vietnamese. So I think his son is actually king right now, technically. He has no real power. All of the power is held by Hun Sen, who's been in the news recently. I think he just basically appointed his son the new leader of the country, and that's a whole other topic, though. But to bring this back, one of the weird alliances that came out of that period was the Khmer Rouge hating the Vietnamese and allying with the Chinese, also allied with another enemy of the Soviets and the Vietnamese, which was, of course, the United States. The United States rather liked the fact that the Khmer Rouge did not get along with the Soviets, or the Vietnamese for that matter. And so when they fell out with the Vietnamese and the Soviets and aligned with the Chinese, the United States actually jumped in and said, hey, we'll give you some support. Mostly in the early days, it was in the form of diplomatic support. But in the 1980s, when that is to say the Khmer Rouge were fighting with the Vietnamese, there was probably a not inconsiderable amount of CIA support or other clandestine support coming across the Thai border. Thailand shares a border with Cambodia. And Thailand's government, which was then controlled by the army, still is, but it was then too, at that time, saw an interest in trying to ensure that communists in the region were tied down fighting with each other in Cambodia, rather than focusing on any shenanigans within Thailand. Obviously, the CIA shared that interest, and so both Thai secret services and the American intelligence services both cooperated to intervene in the affairs of Cambodia with regard to that war effort. So China, the Khmer Rouge, and the United States on one side, and then the puppet Cambodian government, the Vietnamese, and the Soviets on the other side. Kind of an odd arrangement, but that's how geopolitics shakes out sometimes. Anyway, to bring this back to the original topic, relations between the United States and Vietnam were correspondingly poor in the 1980s. And again, that ranged basically the 15-some years after the end of American involvement in Vietnam in 1975. So from 75 to roughly 1990, relations were not great. But otherwise, the United States was pretty disinterested in Vietnam, and the Vietnamese were fairly disinterested in the United States. When communism collapsed, actually that's an overstatement, when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, things changed a little. After that, well, I should say too, in the mid-late 1980s, the Vietnamese themselves had started to liberalize their economy. They started to move away from some of the hardline policies they'd implemented earlier. And as the war in Cambodia drew down, the interest the United States had in fucking with them, for lack of a better term, for intervening in the affairs of Cambodia and Vietnam, all of that incentive went away. Like, the Cold War was over, so like, why bother? What's the point? So at that point, there weren't really any significant barriers to normalization. And obviously, Vietnam wanted to improve its economy. They'd already started implementing reforms, and the United States was a lot more open to trade with Vietnam. And the United States, for its part, was interested in normalizing relations with Vietnam, not only for trade, but also just for strategic reasons. They were seen as a pretty natural counterweight to China, which the United States had kind of recently fallen out with over, all of the murder happening in Tiananmen Square, 1989. And those two factors together just meant naturally that they improved their ties. So again, it's not a sexy answer. Basically, it just happened. That is to say, normalization of Viet-American ties just happened very organically. To a degree, it kind of started after the war, just by dint of inertia. Like, nobody really cared to do otherwise. But after the Cold War, in particular, there were no barriers and there were good incentives to normalize, and so they just did it.
Basically,
it just made sense.
Relations normalized because the two entities agreed that they were annoyed with similar people's bullshit.
Pretty much.
And it said, you know what? We stand against this, you stand against this, I guess we're on the same side for this issue, and then you just hate each other less year by year.
Yeah. I think maybe some people find it strange because, given the ferocity of the Vietnam War, you might think there was a lot more bitterness, residual bitterness between the peoples of the United States and Vietnam. But in practice, no, actually. They've pretty well moved on. Vietnam in particular is a very young country. Like, most of the population there is under 30, I want to say. So living memory within Vietnam of the Vietnam War is not really much of a thing anymore. There are relatively few people in the country that actually have direct memories of the conflict. And, given how normal things have been between the United States and Vietnam since then, especially again since the Cold War ended, there's not really a lot of antipathy held towards the United States. We haven't really messed with them much. They haven't messed with us, so there's not really a lot of grounds for complaint. In so much as people complain, it's either nationalists complaining about the United States, complaining about human rights violations, or it's liberals in Vietnam complaining about a lack of, American action vis-a-vis human rights violations. But beyond that, nobody really cares that much about what happened back in the 70s. Older folks care. There are memories there. But beyond that, not so much. And within the United States, it's kind of similar. The Vietnam War was hugely contentious within American politics. And it's going to go down in history as like a seminal moment in the country's history. But at the same time, it's yesterday's news. Like, there's new drama. There's always new drama in the United States. After the war ended, people moved on to other things. The 70s oil crises, the Reagan Revolution, deregulation, the end of the Cold War, globalization, 9/11. The United States can be a very happening place. So there's always something to bitch about if you are so inclined. So Vietnam just kind of got pushed out. People still remember it, especially the people who served in it. But broader society moved on. And so as a result, both the United States and Vietnam benefited, in so much as that's a benefit, of basically kind of de facto forgetting about the war. That's not great in the sense that it's not good to forget about wars. You kind of want to remember them and kind of learn from them. But, the reality is that people are people and they focus on what's in front of them, not what's in behind them.
Yeah. I'm thinking of a similar recent, I don't know if you would call it a friendship yet, but normalizing ties that has a very bad history, and that's between Japan and Korea. So Japan and South Korea have obviously a lot of issues during the era of Japanese imperialism. I think even before then, I don't know if there was something that happened in the warring or states period or whatever in Japan. But yeah, Japan has basically fucked around with South Korea a lot of times in a way that was very negative. But lately they've been intelligence sharing, I think, and just kind of generally trying to have better communications between each other because they have a lot more in common with each other than their neighbors do. So it kind of behooves them to communicate with each other even if they don't really have the best history between each other.
Yeah. There's definitely. It's not necessarily a great analogy for relations between Vietnam and the United States, because unlike Vietnam and the United States, there's a lot of people in Japan and South Korea are still pissed off about history there. Mm-hmm. That's still a living issue, so to speak. Mm-hmm. Yeah, colonialism hits a little different. Like what the United States did in Vietnam was not really colonialism per se, maybe neo-colonialism at most. But it was a very different form of hegemony that the United States had in Vietnam than the Europeans had. The French had wanted to make them French. Like the French really wanted everybody to learn French and to be culturally French and to integrate Vietnam into France itself. And that was a lot more aggravating to Vietnamese nationalists than the United States, which kind of breezed in and supported a corrupt de facto puppet government. So, people don't like that, but that's not the same thing as trying to denigrate, dissipate, and destroy the native culture and replace it with something else. Like, we didn't really care about that. We didn't want to make them American, I mean, they did wear jeans and drink Coke, and, they did buy American consumer goods, but that doesn't make one American. I know there's a lot of nationalists that might disagree. You can find nationalists out there that think that consuming another country's material culture is a kind of betrayal and represents a watering down of their own culture. But that's always a pretty hardline fringe position, even in very nationalist societies. So, the reality is that the United States was not really trying to proselytize its culture per se. There was trade, but not conversion, like what the Europeans had been trying to do. But that is what Japan did in South Korea. Like, they were trying to destroy Korean culture and convert them, so to speak, into Japanese. There was even a period when they banned people from having Korean names. They actually made everybody adopt Japanese names. And of course, they, as you would expect, like, they banned the use of Korean in schools. You were supposed to speak only Japanese. So, pretty boilerplate stuff as far as colonialism goes. That's exactly what you would expect them to do. But obviously, that kind of stuff really, really grates nationalists. And Korean nationalists are still upset about it. That doesn't even get into the whole forced prostitution thing, which is especially aggravating.
I don't know if it's the right term, but is trying to overwrite people's language and identity and stuff, that kind of has a lot of overlap with genocide, yeah? Because it's not their genetics necessarily, it's a culture per se, but if it is a people and they're being erased, there's a word for that.
So here's the deal there. The answer to that question is that it depends on the definition of genocide that you want to use. So, like, genocide baseline definition involves the murder of people that are a part of a particular target group of some kind. Generally the term is used with regard to ethnic groups, but it can be other groups too. Not really political groups. Some people throw around politicide, but that's not really a thing necessarily. Argentines will disagree with that. I know Dagnip has made the point that he very much believes politicide is a thing. But yeah, that's kind of a different category than genocide. That's not quite the same thing. But you can have a more expansive definition of genocide in which it incorporates not just the active targeted murder of people in a targeted group, but rather also any kind of broader public policy effort on the part of a government or perhaps even non-state actors that is intended to result in the reduction and eventual disappearance of a given ethnic or otherwise identity.
A word that's coming to mind now is assimilation. You're not killing the people, but you're trying to aggressively assimilate them in a way that they are no longer a discrete, distinct entity from your own.
Yeah.
Which is still bad.
Yeah, still bad. So you could define genocide as incorporating activity like that. By that definition, you could consider American efforts to assimilate Native Americans into mainstream white American notions of culture as comprising a type of genocide, a kind of genocide. Some people have made the argument that Russian efforts to assimilate Ukrainians is a kind of genocide, and that by extension, the war against Ukraine is a kind of genocidal war, in so much as the expectation on the part of the Russian government and Russian nationalists is that Ukrainians will eventually learn Russian, adopt Russian culture, and be incorporated into the broader Russian identity. That's a historical thing. Russian nationalists have kind of always thought like that. They even used to call Ukrainians Little Russians for a time in the late 1700s. And that's a term that's still thrown around at times by Russian nationalist commentators. That's a thorny discussion unto itself. Mm-hmm. But yeah, you can consider genocide to have a broader definition that does encompass such type policies. Mm. But yeah, Japan can be considered to have done something like that in South Korea, and that is part and parcel of why relations have been bad for so long. They've gotten a lot better recently. The current president of South Korea is relatively conservative and, relatively speaking, wants to take a somewhat harder line on China and have a more pro-American orientation in South Korea's foreign policy. And as part of that, he wants to improve relations with Japan because Japan is a natural ally against China rather, and is also a mutual ally with the United States. So, it makes sense to have a positive working relationship with them, which they have not had in a while. So he kind of took the lead, took some political risks, and made the effort to try to undo some of the diplomatic damage that had been done by the, again, forced prostitution, very nasty. The comfort women issue is what they call it over there. They don't like calling it forced prostitution, but that's what it was. The president of South Korea, the current sitting president, took the lead in trying to alleviate some of the pressure that had been applied to the relationship by an outbreak, if you will, of the comfort women issue that occurred a couple of years ago and resulted in a court case that levied some odious requirements from some Japanese companies that had been active during the colonial period, and a ruling which also prompted the Japanese government to hit South Korea with some sanctions. So relations were pretty piss poor after that for a long time. They even stopped sharing intelligence, technically. They actually continued sharing intelligence. They just shared it through the United States, which, is better than not sharing it at all, but is also kind of stupid and inefficient. Mm-hmm. So, Washington complained about it, but they didn't stop. And so the United States was quite pleased when eventually this president kind of came out and said, okay, this is dumb. Let's clean this up. And they've markedly improved relations since then. But that's not going to stop it from happening again. The reality is that sooner or later, something's going to happen that pisses off the nationalists in one or the other country. And this thing is going to flare up again. So hopefully, given the progress made recently, that won't be for a while, but invariably it'll happen again. It keeps happening. Like you can create a whole timeline of flare-ups like this that have bedeviled the relationship between South Korea and Japan over the past 50 years. So, the trend line is quite clear. You can expect it to happen again at some point. But for now, we're in a quiet period. We're entering a quiet period for which we should be thankful. So hopefully they can make the most of that and, make some diplomatic gains economically, politically, geostrategically, what have you, all the categories. Tangents.
Fun tangents.
Yeah. Are we doing okay on time? We've kind of been blowing through it.
Yeah, got another 20 minutes.
20 minutes, wow. Okay. Yeah, the world's been pretty happening. Gosh, what do we have?
There was one question about Navy spies and China.
Yeah, that's right. I saw that story and I was like, oh man, fuck. It only ever gets harder. So, all right, so here's what happened. There were two guys in the U.S. Navy, and they have basically been arrested for selling secrets to the Chinese, specifically to the Chinese government. And that it's going to happen, right? That people are going to spy. There's always people who are, desperate for money or who are pissed off because they didn't get a promotion or, whatever kind of dumb shit. People have their reasons for, betraying their country, which is basically what it is. Generally not good reasons either. This is another tangent, but very frequently the people who engage in treason, to whatever degree, frequently do so for like the dumbest shit. Think Benedict Arnold. I didn't get the promotion. Guess I have to betray my country now. Anyway, yeah, that's a recurring theme. But the issue here is that the two sailors who were implicated and have been arrested were naturalized American citizens who were originally from China. And that's a recurring theme. A lot of guys who get nailed for selling secrets to China very frequently have a background in China, are from China, or maybe like second-gen immigrants. And so, that doesn't mean anything. Like, people from China who are naturalized citizens are full citizens and should be treated as such. Vast majority of them are just patriotic Americans who never have any issues. So that's fine. But the Chinese government has been very successful as far as espionage with targeting that particular group. They home in on them. It's not always naturalized citizens. Some of them are just, migrants, green card holders, whatever. But the Chinese government has been quite successful. Not always. It's not like 99% success rate, but in general, they know who to target, right? They don't walk up to just anybody. They pretty well specifically have an MO at this point of targeting people who were born in China or who are second-generation Chinese. And that seems to work for them. So the reason that's worth mentioning is because thus far, Sino-American competition has not, by and large, resulted in a general negative impression in the United States of Chinese people, which is surprising, one, and also a very good thing, right? Historically, whenever the United States has had some kind of rivalry with another country, people have taken a dim view of people from that country on an individual level. Less so with the Soviets, but like in terms of like Japan, for example, racism was an issue. So a lot of people have kind of been at pains to try to drive home the point that whatever problem the United States has with China is with the Communist Party of China, not with the people of China. So the issue, though, is that that could get increasingly difficult if the Chinese government continues to target Chinese Americans and continues to succeed to varying degrees. I'm optimistic it won't be a problem, but also it's the 2020s, and optimism is very much not the order of the decade. Mm-hmm. So I would encourage all parties interested in the topic, especially in the United States, to please continue driving home the point that issues between China and the United States are between governments, not people. We've been doing really good on that thus far, and I think we can keep doing it, but it does require effort and reiteration. So I don't want to sound like a, bore driving home, sounding like a Sunday school teacher driving home a moral lesson, but it's worth repeating.
Wait, you're saying, hang on. You're saying that the people of a country aren't necessarily the drivers of the decisions of the government of that country on a daily basis?
Yes.
That's crazy.
Patently obvious to most, not always to everyone. So again, a rare success story. It's been working thus far. We've been very good about that. Please continue the good behavior. But other than that, yeah, just spy is going to spy, basically. Espionage is going to happen. It's no shock. I don't know how sensitive the secrets they were giving were. I don't think the U.S. Navy is going to be forthcoming on that, most likely. But they are going to nail them to the wall, for sure. And they've already got the book thrown at them pretty much last time I checked. But beyond that, like as far as the implications, there's none. It's just part of a general trend. There's no surprises there as far as that goes.
You're telling me that spies have been spying on people? I believe it.
Yeah. Yeah, it's probably only going to get worse from here.
There was another question. Do you think U.S. military guarantees to Taiwan or economic considerations with China are more important in the preservation of Taiwanese independence? Do you think China's response to Russian sanctions was significant? I guess those are two different questions.
Yeah. So wait, what was the first question again?
First question was, do you think U.S. military guarantees to Taiwan
Taiwan.
or the economic considerations are more important in preserving Taiwanese independence?
I guess I would ask for elaboration on what they mean by the economic considerations as far as securing Taiwan's independence. I mean, I guess he's asking, is Taiwan's independence better guaranteed through economic interests, as in stability of trade between China and Taiwan, or is it better served by military deterrence, underlined by the United States?
Yeah, that's how I would interpret it.
Yeah, okay. So in that case, the United States and the military deterrent is more important, I would argue. Because the thing about trade between Taiwan and mainland China is that it's a lot more important to Taiwan than it is to Beijing. You know, Beijing definitely has benefited from trade with Taiwan, but you know, if they stop trading with Taiwan, it's not the end of the world for them. It would be pretty significantly disruptive to Taiwan, on the other hand. So there's a lot of leverage that Beijing has to bring to bear there if they wanted to. And in so much as they have not, it's been because they have kind of taken a relatively mild, slow approach to the problem, right? They don't really want to go hard and really pressure Taiwan too much because they don't want to instigate some kind of military conflict. But they don't want to give up on it either. So their attitude is just to make Taiwan as economically dependent on mainland China as possible, and that by doing so in the long run, mainland China will generate enough economic leverage and perhaps also political leverage, in so much as economic actors have significant influence in Taiwan's political system, by which mainland Chinese actors could organize, negotiate, or otherwise instigate some kind of push towards peaceful reunification. That's possible, but it gets more politically difficult as the Communist Party of China's reputation declines, as it has pretty considerably over the past 5 years, especially in Taiwan. But the viability of that strategy aside, that strategy is purely optional on the part of Beijing. Like, they don't have to do it like that. You know, if they wanted to cut off Taiwan economically, it would do a lot of damage and it would give pretty significant incentive for peaceful reunification. I don't think it would work per se. But that said, you know, there's no deterrent to China just invading Taiwan just for economic reasons. And that's why the military deterrent is more important, in my mind. Yeah, the military deterrent kind of takes away the easy solution for the Communist Party of China. You know, if not for that, no amount of trade in the world would really be able to stop them, right? You know, however much credit the Communist Party of China would get for peaceful reunification by way of trade, that isn't going to make anybody in the party look nearly as hot and sexy as a short, victorious war would. Every nationalist in China would love a successful invasion of Taiwan. You know, that's a little bit crass, but, you know, nationalists are nationalists. They have a reputation.
We see glory in battle.
Yeah, that's a kind of a recurring thing. That's a recurring theme among all nationalists all over the world, especially the younger ones. So, you know, the party would generate a considerable amount of popularity and legitimacy if they could pull that off. And so, in so much as they have avoided doing that, it's been because there is a deterrent stopping them from doing so. And that deterrent is mostly the United States. So yeah, military considerations, I would argue, are more important to Taiwan's independence than economic factors. And I'm open to debate on that. You know, if somebody has a good counterpoint, feel free to let me know. I'm always interested in new perspectives, but that's my current understanding anyway. I got some fun questions tonight.
Yeah. Good job, chat. Chat hasn't been getting in too many fights. There's A little bit of a discussion about the NATO scare of they could push east and just take over the world. But I think that kind of falls into the propaganda wars. NATO, I feel like with the addition of Finland, you could see it that way if you're looking at it on a map, that they're aggressively expanding east or something. But to me, it looked like a reaction to Russia going west.
Yeah, NATO expansion is a whole thing. That's a whole topic of debate. You know, we can get into that, but it's going to take more than the 15 minutes we have left.
All right, NATO expansion, the good sides and the bad sides in 10 minutes or less. Go.
Yeah. It's a worthy topic, but it's one that I would want to kind of be more careful with, especially considering how sensitive a lot of people can be about that. For what it's worth, I would argue that NATO's expansion eastward was not especially aggressive, or, well, really, I would argue that it hasn't been aggressive at all. Most of the rationalization that Eastern European and Central European states had for wanting to join was fear of Russia, potentially a revanchist Russia that might occur in the future, as it ended up happening, present on their part. For the United States, though, which is probably the more important actor in this conversation for people critical of NATO expansion, our rationalization is, fuck it, why not? Like there was no malice, like there was no strategic thinking. In fact, in so much as there was strategic thinking about NATO expansion, major strategic thinkers opposed it. They said, why? Like, what? All of these states are going to be de facto dependents on the United States, right? Because, if the United States comes under attack, by, I don't know, like aliens or some shit or whatever, there's not going to be a hell of a lot like fucking Slovenia is going to be able to do about it, right? They're not going to come to our defense in the event that shit hits the fan. We will come to their defense, according to the treaty, if something happens to them. So basically, by allowing all of these countries into NATO, we're just expanding our potential workload. For what benefit exactly? Like, the realist argumentation was very much critical in that vein of NATO expansion over the course of the 1990s and aughts. So strategically, it was kind of a non-starter, but we did it anyway. And the argument in favor was, as I said, fuck it, why not? Like, what's the reason not to do it? Like, Russia's going to be mad about it? I mean, okay, but we're not going to do anything to them. They know we're not going to do anything to them. We have good relations. We're trying to normalize relations after the end of the Cold War, and it looks set to continue for the foreseeable future. So, like, yeah, just do it, and then everything will be fine. Everybody kind of had a very rosy notion of what the future was going to look like back in the 90s. The expectation is that relations with Russia would continue to normalize and would remain normalized forever. Everything will be copacetic. Our economies will integrate. Maybe Russia will democratize and normalize its political system. And then in the long term, it'll integrate with the West to some degree. Maybe not European Union membership per se or NATO membership, but some kind of new economic and security architecture, as the professionals like to call it, was expected to emerge organically over time. We don't know what it'll look like, but something will happen and something will emerge eventually later on, etc. Like, they didn't know exactly, but the general mood was pretty optimistic. And so Russian complaints about NATO's expansion eastward were not really taken all that seriously, because, implicit in Russian complaints is the idea that they had something to worry about. And everybody kind of knew that wasn't really true, like, especially given Russian intelligence penetration of Western intelligence agencies. You would think they, of all people, that is to say Russian intelligence assets, would know better than anyone that the West had no ill intent towards Russia in the 90s or aughts. Like, we didn't care. We were not paying attention. That's been the big complaint I've seen among Russia analysts criticizing America's Russia for a Russian policy over the past several decades. Their criticism is not that we went too hard on Russia or even that we went too soft. It's that we weren't paying attention at all. Like, it was very much a neglected part of the foreign policy portfolio in Washington for the better part of 30 some years after the Cold War ended. So, I'm kind of joking when I say the justification was fuck it, why not? But actually, that is pretty accurate. Like, there wasn't a particular reason to do it. They just kind of did it for the sake of doing it. I think there was some justification in terms of like democratization. There was a sense that, in so much as joining NATO required applicants to meet certain standards of democratization, that it was a good tool by which to try to incentivize good behavior on the part of new governments that had taken control in formerly communist states in Central and Eastern Europe, who were trying to integrate with the West. But you'll note that that is not like an argument for invading Russia in the future, right? That was not a national security argument. That was very much a poli-sci major type argument. And in so much as that was the case, that really gives you an idea of just how much drift there was in terms of NATO as an institution after the Cold War ended. Like, Russians like to say, well, why did NATO continue to exist after the Cold War ended? Right? It's because we're up to something. They're out to get us. It's an anti-Russian institution. Well, the reality is that it continued to exist just because that's what bureaucracies do. Bureaucracies always persist. Like, it's just sheer inertia. Like, just because a bureaucracy no longer serves its purpose doesn't mean it's going to fold immediately. Like, that is an interest group within any kind of political system. Bureaucracies always find reasons to continue to exist, like, bar none. There's always a reason. They always find excuses. NATO was no exception. They kept finding new missions, like democratization, or security on the fringes of Europe, or counterterror. After 9/11, counterterrorism was the big one. And so there was a big shift in kind of trying to find ways that NATO could contribute to the mission in Afghanistan, ISAF. And then eventually some stuff happened in Ukraine, and NATO kind of shifted gears and said, actually, maybe we should focus on the conventional stuff again. It took them a while to get back to it, but, Russia acting up kind of gave them an excuse to return to their roots, so to speak. And so that's very much been the focus more recently. But Russian arguments that NATO is inherently anti-Russia and that the fact that it didn't disband it after the Cold War ended kind of ignores the fact that there was a lot of debate about that. Not a lot of people were really wanting to disband NATO in particular. It was seen as kind of a useful institution, but not because of its ability to contain not because of its ability to contain Russia, but just because of its power as an institution that could incentivize behavior on the part of newly democratizing states, etc. It was just a kind of an institute. It was kind of a cause unto itself, if you like. Again, just why not? Like, you've already.
Well, to me, it seems a little bit like the general concept of if you make an alliance and you have a clear threat, when the threat ceases to exist, you don't just immediately disband the military alliance, because you did a lot of work to establish that by having all the people who are going to be having those conversations with the other member states of, okay, if a threat comes up, you talk to this person, we send troops this way, we back you up like this, we share intelligence like this. So just because the Soviet Union collapses doesn't mean that you're just going to like throw out your military alliance. And it also doesn't mean that you're instantly going to put a ton of trust and faith in Russia. Like, you're not going to be like, okay, well, since the Soviet Union collapsed, Russia, you're now our best friend, and we trust you implicitly just with whatever you say and whatever you do. It makes sense that you would just keep the structures that you've built in case of a future problem.
Yeah, that's a fair point. Institutional momentum is also a factor. Institutions that are built up over time into a finely honed tool. You wouldn't just throw that out. At the end, you might try to find new uses for it. So yeah, that was part of the argumentation at the end of the Cold War. We've got this tool that we built up over time. Why abandon it now when we could adapt it to do something useful in the future? There was never any agreement on what that might be. That didn't go anywhere. But ultimately, it did stick around, and obviously that put off a lot of people in Russia. So I don't blame them for being skeptical. All through the Cold War, NATO was like the boogeyman that was out to get them. But the reality is that it's just a bureaucracy, right? It's just an institution. It's not symbolic of some broader, deeper antipathy towards Russia. It's just a security grouping, most of whose members are not really capable of invading Russia, or anybody for that matter. They really are mostly dependent on the United States and, to a lesser degree, France and Britain for their security. And, given budget cuts in Britain, probably not even them anymore. So yeah, NATO is basically just a defense pact, which is exactly what it's, advertised as. Now, if you want to be skeptical about, say, interventions by the United States, France, and Britain over the past couple decades, yeah, fine, I get that. But that wasn't NATO, right? Slovenia wasn't invading Libya. They were not participating, as far as I know.
But did Slovenia get yelled at in the halls of the bureaucrats for not intervening?
Yeah.
Slovenia, we're really counting on you to intervene in this with us.
Yeah, therein lies the rub. So yeah, there's good reason to be skeptical of Western governments. I don't begrudge people for not trusting them, but at the same time, like, what is the impetus for the U.S. or France or whomever else to kind of try to what? I don't even entirely know what the Russian nationalist concern is. Like, I've heard people talk about the West wanting to break up Russia or to dominate Russia, or I've heard theories like that, but they never make any sense to me. Like, what's the point of doing that?
Mm-hmm.
Gain access to Russian natural resources. We already had access to Russian natural resources. Like, Russia was already pumping out natural gas and oil. Like, they already had an incentive to do that themselves. In fact, Russia was more dependent on, exports of those resources to Europe than Europe was on importing them. So what's the point in taking over a country that already has good incentive to sell you all of the stuff that you want from them?
Mm-hmm.
Like, it doesn't make sense to me anyway that would be a concern. Now, maybe you could argue that there was geopolitical concern, like Russia is trying to undermine the global order, and the United States wants to change the government for that reason. But that's also like way oversold. The Vladimir Putin's government and the Russian government in general, since the Cold War ended, has been pretty comfortable at the international world order. I mean, even after they were assassinating people in other countries, with polonium and all that shit, and assassinating people in their own country, the journalists, like all of that stuff that created tensions, the West pretty much just ignored that. Like, there were some sanctions applied, but they were pretty minor. Like, obviously they were insufficient to deter future aggression. So, clearly the West was not going especially hard on Russia. The priority was very much on importing natural gas and oil, among other goods. Also just maintaining normal economic relations generally seemed to be prioritized. So, I don't really see how anybody in Russia could argue seriously that the West was trying to contain or really challenge Russia. Like, really, they were literally letting Russia get away with murder for the better part of 20 years. And somehow that's not enough for Russia to feel secure. Like, I don't buy that. So the international world order was working fine for Russia. I can understand concerns given interventions in Libya, Iraq, etc. But I don't think anybody in either Russia or outside of Russia seriously ever expected that to happen to Russia. Russia has nuclear weapons, so it's not like anybody in the U.S. was just going to arbitrarily invade Russia and try to take it over, because of some, trumped up bullshit story like the WMD story in Iraq. Like, that was never going to happen. If we tried it, then we get nuked, right? We can't invade Russia conventionally, in that style. So that was not a real concern to me. You could argue that the CIA might try a soft coup or maybe a color revolution. I know a lot of people are like really interested in that, really invested in the color revolution narrative, but I don't really buy that either. The whole color revolution thing was really played up hard by governments authoritarian governments, really. They made the argument that the color revolutions of all kinds were fronts by the CIA to try to change governments into more pro-Western governments, which I don't buy either. I've never found that narrative convincing. Like, if you look at the color revolutions as they happened, most of them were started by civil society organizations of one kind or another that had an obvious vested interest in good governance. The Orange Revolution in Ukraine, the Rose Revolution in Georgia. Like, all of those were substantive, grassroots-driven movements. And I grant you that there are government agencies in the United States that gave money to civil society institutions in those countries. The National Endowment for Democracy, in particular, is kind of a boogeyman to a lot of critics in that regard. But it's a pretty weak institution. Like, having grants and giving them to like minor groups in Georgia and Ukraine, that's not going to be a game changer. You know, if you're somebody who really wants the United States government to be very proactive in promoting democracy abroad, the National Endowment for Democracy, as well as other efforts, you know, accumulatively propagated by the U.S. government to do so, are like way insufficient. Like, you know, they want them to do way more. You know, it's just not enough to really make a big difference. But the fact that they're there at all upsets, you know, dictators and other nationalists, because they don't like the idea of civil society organizations within their countries having links to foreigners. You know, they see that as a form of foreign interference. You know, there's probably more than a few Americans that would agree with that sentiment. We have quite a bit of lobbying in Washington by foreign governments. But in general, that's allowed. Right, and especially those foreign institutions of whatever kind that might be supporting humanitarian, human rights considerations, human rights movements. They're not the ones that come under a program in the United States. And so much as there's foreign interference in U.S. politics, it's generally people complaining about the Israel lobby. You know, that's some of that is not entirely legitimate. Some of that is concerns about the Jews, but other people are just concerned about U.S. support for a country that has a kind of, well, what they would consider a de facto apartheid state. That, again, is a whole nother debate that we do not have time for. We can get into that sometime. But yeah, that's more the crux of concern about Israel lobbying the United States, rather than them coming to the United States and saying, well, we think you should treat your minorities better. If that's all Israel did, then most people would not have a problem with them lobbying in Washington. So, you know, that's kind of the difference there between complaints about foreign interference, quote unquote, in authoritarian systems versus the United States. Like the impetus for complaints in authoritarian states is very much about trying to minimize criticism of clear-cut human rights abuses. So yes, the United States does support human rights institutions of one kind or another, NGOs, civil society organizations, but that support is pretty mild overall. You know, in so much as it made a difference, it was kind of at the margin. You know, by and large, the reason that color revolutions happened was because corrupt and inefficient governments failed to govern, which is why protests, mass unrest, and instability afflicts any given country that experiences those things. You know, some people in the United States, if not the West generally, have this sort of myth in their head that if we support dictators in the Middle East, then we can solve the problem with terrorism. That was a debate that was very common during the War on Terror, the height of the War on Terror. And it was always wrong-headed, because it always implicitly assumed that the reason that terrorism was a problem in the first place was due to some other reason than those dictators. In truth, it was bad governments by dictators in the region that resulted in conditions in those societies deteriorating to the point where terrorism was increasingly seen as a viable alternative. Terrorism, jihadism, Islamism, all of those gained traction as radical ideas in societies where there were no options, you know, economically or politically. So the idea that you can, you know, support dictators in the hope of improving the terrorism problem is like, you know, trying to find the guy who's been setting fires and putting him in charge of the fire department. Like, it's not going to work. So, you know, there's a similar problem with regard to the color revolutions. Like, you may not like the fact that, you know, mass movements with some links to the West gain a lot of traction and change governments and maybe change their orientation to a pro-Western one. But, you know, the principal party that you should hold culpable for those events should be the governments that they overthrew, because those governments were the ones responsible for trying to maintain their legitimacy, and they failed. You know, so trying to prop those governments up in the hope that they'll remain pro-Russian or pro-Eastern or anti-American or whatever, you know, that's fine. You can do that. But the reality is that if they can't maintain support of their people to the point that they incur a revolution, that's on them. You know, you should find a different partner. I've argued before, and I'll argue it again here. Russia could have achieved all of their objectives in Ukraine without the war, right? Ukraine would not have entered NATO, and they could have had a de facto veto over a lot of Ukrainian foreign policy still, all of which they could have done without the war. I would argue even, like, given the Crimean intervention, if you go all the way back to 2014, if Russia had not intervened to take back Crimea and done all of that, Ukraine would have never joined NATO. It would not even be. In fact, Ukraine would de facto be a part of the Russian sphere of influence right now, if not for that. The Crimean adventure is really what catalyzed Ukraine into a Western camp. Before that, Ukrainian society was way split on the NATO issue. Like, there was a lot of people very, very critical of the West and NATO. Like, it's almost certain that it would have been politically impossible for it to happen, given the divide in Ukrainian politics at that time. But the Crimean episode just destroyed Russian credibility in Ukrainian politics. Lots of people turned on them after that. And then the invasion in 2022 happened, and that's fucking it. Like, Ukraine is not going to be a pro-Russian entity after this. Even more to the point, like, if you're a Russian nationalist, the war in Ukraine has been a disaster, not just militarily, but politically. Because again, the Russian nationalist perspective is that Ukrainians are just Russians who have not been sufficiently assimilated and acculturated yet. But the result of this war is that the Ukrainian national identity is being forged in fire, right? This is something you see with national identities all over the world. It's a society in societies that have not yet developed national identities. Generally, it's extreme circumstances like wars, recessions, revolutions, in which that national identity is created. And historically, the Ukrainian identity could be argued to be somewhat watered down and mild on account of, Russian imperial projects to whatever degree. But it was still there. But it's only really now that you've really seen it come into its own. And that's going to be permanent. I have a hard time seeing Ukrainian nationalism being walked back at this point, regardless of outcomes. So in that sense, the Russian war in Ukraine has been extremely counterproductive. It has had the opposite effect of that which was intended. Even if they keep the territories they took, like the rest of Ukraine is like permanently, semi-permanently for the foreseeable future, anti-Russian, pro-Western. So we'll see how that shakes out in practice, but like politically, very self-defeating. Like the whole Russian policy towards Ukraine since 2014 has just been stupidly self-defeating. It would have been so much easier to just continue to let Ukrainian politics be extremely divided and to exploit the pro-Russian sentiment in pro-Russian Ukrainian constituencies. Like Crimea itself, like heavily voted in pro-Russian politicians. Like the vast majority of their representatives in Ukraine's legislature were pro-Russian. And they had enough people in there to just veto any kind of move towards the West, of virtually any kind. Honestly, you could go so far as to say the problem that Russia had was just greed. Like if NATO was all they cared about, very easy to keep Ukraine out of NATO. But they weren't just interested in NATO. They were also interested in the European Union. It was the association agreement with the EU that led to the crackdown that caused the Maidan revolution and eventually the Russian intervention. And, that was much more popular. NATO, people were pretty skeptical of NATO, but the EU in general was much more positively received in Ukraine. And the Russians kind of saw the writing on the wall on that. And that, I think, is where they kind of got greedy. It would have been better if they just relied on corruption in Ukrainian politics, because, that itself would have probably acted as a pretty good barrier to entry for Ukraine as far as European Union membership. That would have been a very difficult task for them. But as is, the European Union has been giving them de facto fast track status. They've been giving them little exemptions here and there that cumulatively have effectively represented fast track status as far as accession. They're probably still like 20 years out, but they're going to get special treatment too on account of the war, basically. So that again was extremely self-defeating. Like the whole nationalist position in Russia, I would argue, and I'm open to debate on this. I'm not going to pretend to be an expert on this. So I'm definitely interested in, pro-Russian rebuttals on this count. But my impression is that the Russian position has been extremely self-defeating, and they would have been way better served taking the more relaxed, indirect approach to exerting their influence in Ukraine. And they could have done way better by doing things that way. But again, that's just a small part of the whole NATO expansion debate, and we're out of time. So if you're interested in further such conversation, join us next time. Hopefully we can get to it in more detail there.
Yeah, I will say that is one of the other hot button topics for chat during World Discussion Time. You've got the Trump-Biden You say either of those words and someone is about to be severely activated and unable to stop themselves. And then also, if you talk about the war in Ukraine, you will have people who will be very severely activated and they cannot stop themselves until there's a nice active fight going in the chat. So as an individual who browses news, I would challenge you to try to understand the stances that you take and think about why you take those stances, and also think about how you can communicate with other people to try to understand their perspective better. Because that's one thing that we really look up to Kukyo for in terms of being able to talk to anyone is, and I would say that you're very skilled at this as well, is just being able to let someone talk and kind of articulate their point and really address the details of their point and ask them about it is a huge life skill that allows you to just know the big picture better. So even if the person you're talking to is incorrect about something, how they got to that point can still inform you about how other people are thinking about this too. So it gives us knowledge about the world to share our perspectives together. So whenever you're going into stuff with a very kind of heated tone when you discuss with people, you're already making something combative that doesn't necessarily have to be. If we're both on the same planet and there's one truth for what's happening here, we should just be sharing information and, like Day 9 says, try to dig for the truth together. So that's a challenge for you. I understand maybe some people, they love their left-leaning stuff, other people, they love their right-leaning stuff, but don't let outrage media consume you, dank as it may be. And as a reminder, we are open to corrections with our discussions that we have here. We are not world experts that know everything all the time. So if we got anything wrong or if new information comes in, feel free to leave a nice YouTube comment or a scathing review. We're open to both of those. The scathing reviews are sometimes more entertaining than the nice comments. So good job, everyone who does those.
Those are always fun. Criticism and feedback are important parts of honing one's understanding of a topic. So certainly, I'm open to input in that regard. I'm not some kind of a super refined expert in these topics. So, if I'm wrong, like I said earlier, I by all means want to learn. Mm-hmm. So please do kind of provide input in that.
Yep, and everyone is looking at the world from a different lens and a different perspective. So everyone has some kind of bias that includes us talking on the show and includes everyone in the chat.
Yeah, there's a lot of stuff we didn't get to today. It's been an eventful 3 weeks.
Yeah, I've been very disconnected from the news between streaming nonstop for 3 weeks and then going out in South Dakota and stuff and catching up with family and everything. I did a very last minute just try to browse through the news headlines, and that's very hit or miss. A lot of it's just drama of he said, she said.
Yeah. I'll tell you what, I'll give you a quick lightning round of headlines.
Let's go.
So Thailand's reformist the leader of Thailand's main reformist party, which won the majority of votes and was said to take power, has basically been blocked in Thailand, so that's not going to happen. There's been a rapprochement between the United States and Saudi Arabia, which could lead to U.S. support for a civilian nuclear program in Saudi Arabia. Deep sea mining could be set to start finally after several years of a de facto moratorium. Food inflation in the UK, 18%, surprisingly high. U.S. credit rating took a hit, reduced. Headline news 10 years ago, now nobody's really surprised so much. That's also an interesting topic. Local council reforms in Hong Kong, making it less democratic. No shock. Israel's judicial drama continues. Mass protests, one of the reforms that the Netanyahu government was talking about, went through. And now the judiciary is looking at potentially overturning it, which could result in a constitutional crisis for the constitution that they don't have. Should be exciting. Turkey now supporting Sweden's accession to NATO, despite the fact that Sweden can't stop burning Korans. That's also an interesting topic. The CIA met with the Taliban. The EU and the US signed a data sharing agreement, which sounds boring, but is important. More inflation in India, Supreme Court ruling review over the past 6 months, Burma civil war, Iran trying to double down and reintroduced policing of the headscarves worn by women. That's another dumb thing. China economy news, U.S. economy news that sounds boring but is also very interesting, but we don't have time to get into that. Other stuff too, but I think that's the gist. Oh, but there's a bunch of weird news. We'll get to that next time. But yeah, that's the lightning round. So yeah, we got a lot to get to for next time. That should be pretty cool.
Nice. Well, I appreciate your input as always, Mr. Agent Smith, and thank you, Fuzzy Cord, for handling questions today. Thank you, chat, for weighing in and providing context to this conversation and giving your takes. I'll try to remember to publish the VOD tonight so you can read the comments during that. And we will see you all on the next episode of World Discussion with Agent Smith.
Yeah, thanks again. Always a privilege. Talk to you next time.
GG. Nice.